Chapter 29:17. She clearly had nothing to do with him anymore. He also knew that she was a woman, so why was he hugging her so frequently? One had to know that men and women should not touch each other. She was unhappy, so she activated her telekinesis and slapped him on the chest. Rongnuat Tianlan, don't touch me, let me go. Her skills were not weak, and she suddenly attacked, so Rongnuat Tianlan could not avoid her. Under her attack, his body trembled, and he fell with her in his arms. Ji Xinyue did not expect that he would rather take her attack than let her go. He would be fine as long as he let go. While she was in a daze, the two of them fell rapidly. The two of them were originally Ji Xinyue below, and Rongnuat Tianlan above. Although Ji Xinyue could not see the ground, she knew that once they landed, she would be his meat cushion. Forget it, meat cushion, so be it. Ji Xinyue could not hit him a second time. She was prepared to be hit, but when she looked down, her eyes widened. This space was originally pure black, but now there were pinpoint red dots of light below. The red dots lit up very suddenly, and in the blink of an eye, they spread into a large area. Those red dots were denser than sesame seeds, and as far as the eye could see, there was a river of red dots flowing below, and they were falling into the river of red dots. Each of them was smaller than a sesame seed. Could they be the eyes of some species? Ji Xinyue had slight trypophobia, so when she saw these densely packed red dots, her scalp almost exploded. Her whole body stiffened. Rongnuat Tianlan, who was falling with her in his arms, suddenly flipped over. Ji Xinyue's vision blurred, and then it was pitch black again. She could not see the red dots anymore. Then she felt his body pause, as if he had forced his feet to land on the ground, and then flew up again with her in his arms. The moment he landed on the ground, she heard a fine cracking sound, as if he had stepped on a pile of small things. Buzz, buzz, buzz. The red dots below suddenly flew up and rushed towards the two of them. The space was originally extremely quiet, but now it was like a nest of wasps had suddenly flown in. The fine sound of flapping wings made one's hair stand on end. In the absolute darkness, the fine red dots rolled over like thick clouds, making it impossible to see what they were, but they were definitely alive. It seemed that he had come to hug her just now because he saw this, and not because he wanted to take advantage of her. Rongnu Yishenlan flew extremely fast in the dark with her in his arms. However, when he landed on the ground just now, it was as if he had stepped on Pandora's box. Countless small red dots in front of them lit up and flew up. They began to surround and intercept the two of them. What are they? Ji Xinyue suppressed the guilt in her heart and asked in a low voice, her fingers clenched tightly. Blood parasite worm. Rongnuatian answered with 3 words, and her body suddenly sank again. Rongnuat Tianlan, Tianlan on the other hand, blood Tianlan gu, and Tianlan yu Tianlan, but Tianlan lan Tianlan with Tianlan. Once they were alarmed, they would relentlessly pursue and attack. They would not stop until they had bitten the opponent into a skeleton. She did not expect there to be one here. She watched as the blood goo rushed towards them from all directions like a tsunami, and they could not avoid it. Chapter 29:18. Just as Rongnuatian was about to cast a spell, Ji Xinyue suddenly moved in his arms, as if her arms were about to move. Rongnuatian was shocked. Don't move. I won't. If she hit him again, he wouldn't be able to hold her. He was about to say, I won't do anything to you, but he stopped halfway. A faint green light rose up from Ji Xinyue's arm. Both of them were enveloped by a flat circular cover. This cover was quite heavy. Rongnuatian couldn't control the cloud anymore, and fell to the ground with her in his arms. Almost at the same time, the blood parasite worms also attacked and slammed into the flat circular cover like a violent storm. Fine slapping sounds could be heard, as if they were hit by countless quicksand. What is this? Rong Yuetian's surprised voice was heard. One of his arms was still holding Ji Xinyu, while the other hand started to touch the cover. The cover was slightly soft, and felt like fish skin, a little slippery and a little cold. Although Rong Yuetian was a knowledgeable deity, this was the first time he saw this. He liked to hunt for treasures, and when he saw something he had never seen before, he couldn't help but touch it again and again. Ji Xinyu's voice trembled in his arms, "Don't touch." Rong Yuetian's hand stopped, and he stared at her in his arms. Her back was facing him, so he could only see her long black hair that flowed like water. This cover wasn't big, the two of them were squeezed inside, body to body, there wasn't any space at all. The slightest movement between them could be sensed by the other party. Her body was warm, and she was in his arms, his lips were almost behind her ear, her body had a faint fragrance that intoxicated him. Just now, he was in a hurry to save her, and he was chased by the blood parasite worms, so he didn't notice that he was in her arms, and only reacted when she hit him. Now that the two of them were squeezed in this cover, their skin was touching, and they were out of danger for the time being. Rong Yuetian hugged her, his heart fluttering. He could naturally feel her trembling, and was puzzled. What is this cover? Gu defense barrier. Ji Xinyu said these 3 words, feeling a little bitter. This cover was given to her by a friend who played with Gu. He said that once it was activated, it could prevent all Gu worms from eating it. It was a first-class item. There weren't many people who played with Gu in this world, and ordinary people couldn't easily come into contact with Gu worms, so Ji Xinyu casually threw the cover into her storage space to let it rot. Until today, when she encountered these Gu worms, she finally remembered. It was also her first time using this thing, but she didn't expect it to be so perverse. It was actually connected to the user's touch. Just now, Rong Yuetian had clearly only touched the inner wall of the anti-Gu shield. She, who was holding the shield, actually felt as if his palm was touching her body, and it was even touching a more sensitive area. Ji Xinyu had lived for thousands of years, and had almost always walked the Jianghu dressed as a man. Although she often made friends with all kinds of people, because of her own caution, there were very few opportunities for them to touch skin. She had never been touched by anyone before, therefore, she was still inexperienced in this aspect. Right now, her entire body was curled up in Rong Yuetian's embrace. If he were to touch her like this, that feeling, she couldn't say it. Her heart was beating twice as fast, and her blood seemed to be flowing twice as fast. Her heart was in a panic, and the blood was still rushing towards her face. Chapter 29:19. She thought that he would just touch it once, but she didn't expect him to touch it again and again. She couldn't help but tremble and finally stopped him. Fortunately, Rong Yuetian was still quite obedient. He stopped when she didn't let him touch her. This allowed Ji Xinyu to finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, Rong Yuetian's next sentence caused her heart to skip a beat. Gu defense shield. This is the first time I've heard of this name. His body moved slightly. Ji Xinyu knew that this person was very curious. She was afraid that he would reach out his claws again, so she said fiercely, "You're not allowed to touch it again even if it's the first time you've heard of it." Rong Yuetian was speechless. Why was this girl so nervous about him touching it? Was she afraid that he would break it? He looked up and saw that their shield had crashed into the pile of blood parasite worms after it landed. The blood parasite worms were very persistent. They flew around the shield and gathered into a group to attack the shield fiercely. They made swooshing sounds that were more rapid than the dense rain. Rong Yuetian knew about these blood parasite worms. Although they were small, their teeth were very sharp. Once surrounded by them, even a rhinoceros with thick skin would be bitten into a skeleton in an instant. Even a steel fortress around him would be corroded by the venom secreted by the blood parasite worms. But now, this defensive barrier was only a thin layer. yet it was able to withstand the attacks of the blood parasite worms. It was obviously very sturdy. Why was she still afraid of him touching it? Rongyu Ishinlan had a rebellious mentality. The more others didn't want him to do something, the more he couldn't help but want to do it. He didn't want to touch the shield at first, but now he wanted to touch it again. He moved again. Don't move. Ji Xinyue's voice was fierce, with a hint of nervousness. He couldn't even move. Rongyu Ishinlan looked at the densely packed blood parasite worms outside the cover and asked a very realistic question. These blood parasite worms have a special characteristic. If they don't bite their prey, they won't retreat. In other words, they won't disperse on their own no matter what. Then, are we going to stay in this cover for a long time? Rongyu Tianlan didn't object to it for a long time. He and she were both immortals now. Even if they didn't eat for a few years, they wouldn't starve to death. They could still be together day and night and cultivate feelings. In fact, it was not bad. However, if they were trapped here, the sword would have been taken away by someone long ago. His breath was right behind her ear, carrying his characteristic warm breath as it blew on her ear. Ji Xinyu's ears were burning hot, as if they were covered in chili sauce. As he spoke, her body also became numb from the wind. Damn it! She cursed in her heart. Her ears had always been her Achilles heel, her sensitive area. Even if someone of the same sex whispered in her ear, her body would still feel numb. What's more, the person who was whispering in her ear was Rongyu Tianlan. That kind of numbness was even more powerful. It could be described as numbing. He had only said a few words, but her ears were already burning red like coral beans. Don't talk. Ji Xinyu could only shout again. Rongyu Tianlan, who was behind her, stiffened slightly and sighed softly. You can't even talk. Xinyu, you're so fierce. There was a hint of grievance in his voice. Ji Xinyu. She shivered again and shouted, shut up. Chapter 29-20. Rongyu Tian could see it. He lowered his eyes and looked at her red little ears. He seemed to have suddenly realized something. The corners of his lips curled up into a smile. Sure enough, he stopped talking. His eyes started to stare at the Gu defense shield. He looked at the faint blue light flowing on it and finally saw that it was actually a Sanskrit character. Ji Xinyu looked at the densely packed red dots outside. Because of the reflection of the Gu defense shield, she could finally see the appearance of these blood goo worms. Each of them was the size of a mung bean and their shape was exactly the same as a cockroach. However, their mouthparts were sharp needles that were blood red in color. The red dots she saw just now were the sharp mouths of these blood goo worms. Ji Xinyu felt like 1,000 alpacas were roaring in her heart. She was afraid of the dark, afraid of cockroaches, and had trypophobia. Now, all three of them were gathered in one go. Goosebumps rose and fell on her body. Her arm that was supporting the Gu defense shield trembled slightly. If possible, she wanted to faint. But she couldn't faint now. If she fainted, she wouldn't be able to hold the shield. The person who gave her this Gu defense shield also gave her an extremely complicated incantation. Every word of this incantation was very difficult to understand and the length was also very long, so it was also very difficult to memorize. That person taught it to her more than 10 times before she could barely remember it. Fortunately, her memory was quite good. As long as she remembered something, she wouldn't forget it easily. This incantation was originally thrown into the corner of her memory. Now that she took it out and recited it silently, she still stuttered a little at first. In addition, there was Rongyu Tianlan with a strong aura beside her, so she was always on guard. It was easier for her to memorize the wrong words when she was multitasking. And once she said a wrong word, the shield would tremble a few times like a pendulum, as if it was going to fall apart at any time. This made Ji Xinyu's heart palpitate. This was not what made her even more miserable. What gave her a headache was that she had been squeezed inside the cover, which had been flat like a pie. She had originally planned to roll out of the tunnel with the cover, but this flat shape did not allow her to roll at all. She had also tried to control this shield to fly, but it was all in vain. This shield didn't move at all. In other words, although the blood parasite worms couldn't bite them, they couldn't escape either. Not only did the densely packed red dots outside not disperse, more and more of them gathered. This made her even more alarmed, and her heartstrings trembled. In her nervousness, she mispronounced another sentence. This time, she mispronounced a crucial sentence. The cover actually rose and fell, shaking violently. She didn't realize it herself. If there was someone standing outside at this moment, they would see that the cover was like a quilt wrapped around the two of them, and the quilt was moving up and down. Tell me the incantation, I will support it. Rollercoasters, who was behind him, suddenly spoke. This time, he raised his head slightly and spoke to the top of her head. At least it didn't hurt her ears anymore. He actually saw through it. Ji Xinyue shook her head slightly. The mnemonic chant was too complicated. Furthermore, the mnemonic chant wasn't the only thing that was needed to support the mnemonic chant. It also required a special method of circulating one's qi. It wasn't something that could be taught in a short period of time. Rollercoasters was silent for a moment before she spoke again from behind her. Are the runes circulating on this cover the mnemonic chant? Ji Xinyue's eyes widened. He could see the runes on the cover. Didn't they say that only the person supporting the cover could see them? Did this guy have superpowers? Chapter 29-21. She couldn't help but turn back to look at him. But the two of them were too close. When she turned back, her lips brushed against his, their lips touched, and Ji Xinyu froze for a moment. She immediately turned her head back, her heart thumping wildly. Strange. This guy was like her nemesis. Every time she met him, she was in danger, and he took advantage of her. Was he doing it on purpose? Rollercoasters suddenly moved behind her. Ji Xinyue was nervous. In shock, she threatened, I'm warning you, don't get any ideas. Rollercoasters sighed. Heroine, I didn't move. You invaded my lips, you took advantage of me. My first kiss was taken away by you. Ji Xinyue was speechless. That seemed to be the case. She blurted out again, I didn't do it on purpose. Rollercoasters secretly licked his lips and laughed silently, but his voice was still full of grievance. You mean, you took advantage of me and don't want to take responsibility? Ji Xinyue almost scratched her head. Wasn't it the girl who was at a disadvantage? He was a man, and he wanted someone to take responsibility. This was also her first kiss and second kiss. She didn't even ask him to take responsibility. She steeled her heart and said, how is this taking advantage? All I did was touch your lips. At most. She paused. Rollercoasters was curious. At most what? At most, you let me touch you again. Is that what you want to say? Ji Xinyue's face was hot. She did want to say that out of impulse, but before she could say it, she felt that it was inappropriate, so she stopped in time. However, the man behind her was too smart. He could guess what she was going to say halfway through her words and even said it out loud, blocking her right there and then. Fortunately, she was quick-witted. You're thinking too much. How can a man care about this? Because I'm a different man, Rollercoasters said leisurely. Ji Xinyue was speechless. This person was not an ordinary narcissist. How was he different from the rest? Ji Xinyue realized that she was especially impulsive when she was with him. She was just complaining in her heart, but she didn't expect to say it out loud. You're different. How are you different? I'm sorry, I couldn't tell. Rongyuetian smiled and said, are you interested in me now? Turn around and I'll tell you the details. Ji Xinyu's lips twitched. Since when was she interested in him? Which part of her sentence did he read that from? She would never turn back. So as to avoid bumping into him again, you've misunderstood me. I'm not interested in you. She snorted and attacked him. Didn't you want to know what makes me different? Rongyuetian's lips brushed past her earlobe, intentionally or unintentionally, bringing a warm and numbing feeling. Ji Xinyu shrunk back and said angrily, don't talk to me here. Rongyuetian stared at her red earlobes, and her heart fluttered. It turned out that she was so sensitive here. He had the urge to bite her earlobe, but he also knew that this girl was impulsive. If he really bit her earlobe, she would definitely fall out with him and give him a slap. Rongyue Tianlan had already been hit by her palm just now. Rongyue Tianlan didn't want to be hit a second time. The little girl's martial arts skills were not low. She was not a showy fighter when she slapped him, however, if he stole a kiss, she might not be able to react in time. Chapter 29-22. Should he pretend to kiss her ear unconsciously? Ji Xinyue saw that there was a moment of silence behind her. She didn't know that the big bad wolf behind her was already scheming something. She thought that he was finally stopped by her words and let out a sigh of relief. I'm handsome. There's no man more handsome than me on this continent. This is the first thing that makes me stand out from the rest, Rongyue Tianlan suddenly said slowly from behind her. My martial arts is the best on this continent. No one can compare to me. This is the second thing that makes me stand out from the rest. Other men at my age basically have a bunch of wives and concubines, but I don't even have a wife. This is the third thing that makes me stand out from the rest. I'm such an outstanding man, but I still retain my virginity. This is the fourth thing that makes me stand out from the rest. Ji Xinyue listened to him list one by one, two by three, and was stunned. When she was with him before, why didn't she realize that this person was actually such a scoundrel? She didn't know that the previous Rongyue Tianlan wasn't sure of his own feelings. He was even conflicted about his previous life. When he was with her, he always restrained himself, unless he couldn't help himself, but now, he had confirmed his own feelings. Naturally, he would completely let go of his hands and feet to pursue her. His attitude towards her was also much more aggressive. He was originally a playboy and had read many novels. He could even be Shinjuli's counselor when it came to relationships. He had given many great ideas to Shinjuli. Now that it was his turn, he naturally wouldn't be bad. I'm such a unique man. My first kiss was snatched away by you. Don't you think I should let you take responsibility? Rongyue Tianlan's topic finally turned in this direction, ending his uniqueness. Ji Xinyue was stunned for a long time. Finally, she seemed to have remembered something and sneered, I'm a man now. Why should I take responsibility when a man kisses you? Only a woman would let someone take responsibility. Rongyue Tianlan's arm had been hugging her waist. At this moment, he moved up slightly and stopped at the undulation, a man? Are you sure? Ji Xinyue finally realized that something was wrong with her. She felt as if she was struck by lightning. When did I change back? When you entered this cave. Rongyue Tianlan explained, you didn't realize it until now, did you? This cave can remove all pretense. Ji Xinyue. She blushed again. Ever since she entered the cave, her vision had been blacked out and she had been in a state of nervousness. Indeed, she did not realize that she had regained her female form. It turned out that she had always been in her female form and was being taken advantage of by him without realizing it. This was really, originally, Ji Shinyu had been hugged by him the whole time, and she had thought that he was hugging a male body. Although it was strange for two grown men to hug each other, the situation was urgent, and it was understandable that they were trying to avoid the blood goo worms. But now, in this state, Ji Shinyu felt a little hot in his arms, causing even her ears to burn. Let me go first, men and women shouldn't touch each other. Ji Shinyu came up with this excuse again. All right. Rongyu Tianlan readily agreed and immediately moved her arm away from her waist. However, the space in the cage was too narrow. His arm moved away, but his body was still stuck to hers. The two of them were still stuck together like a Taoist yin-yang fish. Being so close to him, although Ji Shinyu tried her best to remain calm, her face was still burning. She tried her best to shrink her body, trying to reduce the surface area of contact with his body. Chapter 29-23. Rongyu Tianlan, who was behind her, suddenly took a deep breath and said, "Don't move." Ji Shinyu was stunned. What was it now? However, she soon realized that something was wrong, because their bodies were pressed against each other, her buttocks were also between his legs. She could clearly feel a hard object arching up there. Although she was a virgin, she was still a person who often roamed the pugilistic world and often called those men brothers. Naturally, she knew some things. At this moment, once she felt the change in Rongyu Tianlan's body, she was stunned and her face immediately turned red. "You've, down," she almost wanted to call him a pervert, but she held it back. She stiffened her body and wanted to move, but the place was only so big, where could she move to? That part of him was getting harder and harder. Ji Shinyu panicked. "Rongyu Tianlan, take it back. If you do this again, I'll castrate you." She moved even harder. Rongyu Tianlan was speechless. How could he take it back automatically? He didn't want it to be like this. This was a normal reaction as a man, okay? The woman he loved was so close to his arms and moving around like crazy. It would be strange if he didn't have any reaction. He raised his arm and held her body, saying in a low voice, "Don't move. If you're obedient, it will return to normal. If you continue to move, I can't guarantee what I will do to you." This was naturally not the time to be aroused, so Rongyu Tianlan tried his best to control himself. He stared at the blood parasite worms outside that were still desperately bumping around, diverting his attention and hers at the same time. "The person who gave you this cover didn't teach you how to move it." Ji Shinyu also glanced at the densely packed goo worms outside. Her scalp went numb again, and her body stiffened. She quickly looked away and shook her head. No, the blood parasite worm was an extremely rare goo worm. Other goo worms didn't have such a clingy characteristic. The person who gave her the cover probably didn't expect her to encounter this, so he only taught her how to avoid the goo worms inside and didn't teach her how to move it out. There were more and more blood parasite worms, and the outside was like a red cloud, tightly surrounding the cover. No matter if she looked up or down, all Ji Shinyu could see were those needle-like red dots. They were like the eyes of a ghost in hell, causing her heart to tighten. She wished she could close her eyes, but she couldn't because she had to hold up the cover. A hand suddenly reached over and covered her eyes. "Are you afraid of this? If you're afraid, then don't look. Don't worry, we'll go out and do some research." Ji Shinyu hurriedly grabbed his hand. "I have to look, or else this cover will break." She suddenly stopped. While she was bickering with him, she had forgotten to recite the incantation. However, the cover was still in good condition. It was even larger than before and much more stable. Just now, because she was nervous, she often misread the incantation, causing the cover to tremble. But now, the cover was as solid as a fortress. There was only one possibility for this to happen. Ji Shinyu couldn't help but turn back, you also know how to support this barrier. Rong Yuetian looked at her with a smile. It's not difficult. He was an ancestor who often made artifacts, so when he saw the flowing runes on the cover, he began to study it. To him, it wasn't impossible to break the spell. His body was close to Ji Xinyu, so her method of channeling and the flow of qi in her body couldn't be hidden from him. Chapter 29-24. Therefore, he quickly grasped the method to support the shield. He was an exalted immortal, so it was naturally much better for him to operate the shield than Ji Xinyu. Ji Xinyu was so distracted that she did not notice when he silently took over the task. Ji Xinyu could not be distracted while operating the shield, but Rong Yuishanlin could multitask and joke with her while operating the shield at the same time. The inside of the shield was as dark as the outside. Ji Xinyu still could not see anything other than the light from the blood parasite worms outside the shield. However, Rong Yuishanlin could still see her. Her face was still red, and her eyes were as bright as stars. Rong Yuishanlin's heart skipped a beat. He suppressed the urge to pull her into his arms and kiss her fiercely. It was not the right time yet. He could not scare her away directly. Take a rest first. I will figure out a way to bring this shield out. Rong Yuishanlin's voice softened. With me here, you don't have to be so stubborn. She was clearly afraid of the dark and these worms, but she insisted on holding on. Ji Xinyu lowered her eyes slightly. He was probably the only person in the world who would always pamper her like a child when they were together. It made her heart, which had been frozen again, faintly show signs of loosening. But he had already broken off the engagement with her. The guard guarding Misty Mountain had also said that they were originally in a heavenly marriage. Once the engagement was broken, the line of marriage would be completely broken. It would be as difficult as ascending to the heavens for them to reconcile. It could be said that it was impossible. Since they were not fated to be together, why bother? She closed her eyes and refused to think about this problem. She began to regulate her breath and meditate. If she was in the same situation as others, Ji Xinyu would not dare to relax for even a moment. However, with him, she inexplicably relaxed and quickly entered a meditative state. After an unknown amount of time, Ji Xinyu seemed to feel something and woke up from her meditative state. She slowly opened her eyes. What she saw was still those densely packed goo worms dancing in the air. She shivered. Awake? How do you feel? Rong Yuishanlin's voice came from in front of her. Ji Xinyu subconsciously answered, much better. After answering, she realized that something was wrong. Before she entered a meditative state, her back was leaning against Rong Yuishanlin. Now, he was in front of her, and there was even some distance between them. Did the space become bigger? Ji Xinyu looked around and was surprised to find that the originally flat goo barrier had turned into an oval. Rong Yuishanlin said, I tried many methods just now, but I couldn't move it. I could only change its shape. He pondered for a moment and said, I have thought of another way, but that method requires our cooperation. Ji Xinyu immediately asked, what method? Rong Yuetian paused for a moment and said, I'm afraid you can't accept this method. Forget it, I'll think of another way. If he told her about his idea, she might think that he was taking advantage of her. Although he really wanted to take advantage of her, he didn't want to do it at this time, and he wouldn't take advantage of her when she was in danger. When necessary, he was still very moral. Ji Xinyu, however, became impatient. You're a grown man, speak more straightforwardly. Stop hemming and hawing. You haven't said anything yet. How do you know that I won't accept it? Rong Yuetian looked at her pair of big bright eyes and paused for a moment. She had no choice but to tell her the method. This method was a little complicated. After he finished speaking, Ji Xinyu didn't reply for a long time. Chapter 29-25. Rongyu Ishinlan coughed and said, I'd better think of another way. He knew that she would not agree because that method was too wretched. However, it was the most practical and fastest way. Ji Xinyue stared at the blood parasite worms outside and suddenly asked, How long have I been meditating? Rongyu Ishinlan answered quickly, 45 minutes. Ji Xinyue thought for a moment and asked again, How much do you know about that sword? Rongyu Ishinlan glanced at her and pondered for a moment. That sword is made of meteoric iron. The sword spirit is very powerful and it is said that it can cut through everything. What about the meteoric iron chain? Ji Xinyue's eyes sparkled. Rongyu Ishinlan raised his eyebrows and looked at her. Why are you asking this? Is there something locked by the meteoric iron chain? Ji Xinyue paused for a moment. I'm just asking. Can that thing be cut? Rongyu Ishinlan pondered for a moment and slowly shook his head. The meteoric iron chain does not belong to this world. It is said that it can lock everything, including gods and demons. Once it is locked, there is no way to open it. The sword you are looking for now is also made of meteoric iron. It may have some special abilities, but it is hard to say if it can cut through the meteoric iron chain. Ji Xinyue did not speak and seemed to be thinking. Rongyu Ishinlan glanced at her and sighed softly. He did not speak and turned his gaze back to the cover and began to think of other methods. He had actually tried many methods, but none of them worked. The cover seemed to be welded to the ground and could not be moved an inch. Other than that method, he had already tried all the methods he could think of in his mind. How could he think of a new one now? He was not confident in his heart. Ji Xinyue suddenly said, Let's try that method. Rongyu Ishinlan was startled and looked up at her. She bit her lips and her cheeks were red, but her expression was firm. I want that sword. So we must break out as soon as possible. Ji Xinyue was the kind of person who would immediately act once she made up her mind. Since she had decided to do it, there was no reason for her to hesitate. She pounced forward and threw herself on him. Let's begin. He didn't forget to threaten, this is an emergency. If you dare to take advantage of me, I'll cripple you. The idea that Rongyu Tianlan came up with was indeed a bit perverted, but it was also very reasonable. The two of them needed to hug each other, but it was not an ordinary hug. Instead, it was a flipping hug. Both of them had to hug each other's legs and bend their bodies into a semicircle. When the two of them hugged each other, they would form a complete circle. Then, each of them would circulate a skill to activate the goo barrier. Once it was activated, they would be able to roll out with it. According to Rongyu Tianlan's explanation, only this kind of method could achieve the balance of yin and yang in one's power. Only then could one truly activate the function of the goo defense barrier. Ji Xinyue felt that only a perverted person like Rongyu Tianlan could come up with such a perverted idea. However, she did agree with the theory. Moreover, the theory was similar to some of the methods that the mysterious person who saved her had taught her. A martial arts practitioner's body was as soft as a willow branch. Ji Xinyue bent down and hugged Rongyu Tianlan's legs, placing his legs on her shoulders. Rongyu Tianlan did not expect her to be so valiant. When his legs were hugged by her, he felt slightly numb. Even an indescribable part of his body showed signs of lifting up. Chapter 29-26. Fortunately, Ji Xinyue could not see it in the dark, or else she might have broken it in a fit of anger. He hurriedly concentrated his mind, and his mouth lowered to his nose, and his nose lowered to his heart, and he suppressed that inappropriate desire. He bent down and hugged her legs. Her legs were long and straight. Although they were separated by clothes, Rongyu Ishin could still feel the tension in her legs. His mind was shaken once again. He suddenly felt that this method was not a test for Ji Xinyue, but for him. She might be challenged for her sense of shame, but he was challenged for his self-control. However, this position was too ambiguous. It was very similar to a position in some erotic novels. Rong Juishan felt that his strong self-control was about to collapse. His heart could not help but beat faster, and he even had the urge to push her down and tear her apart. Suddenly, a cool qi flowed from his legs into his veins. Her voice came along with this qi. What's wrong? Activate your qi. Her voice was steady, and it was obvious that this position did not bring her any ambiguous thoughts. To her, this position was just an ordinary training position. Was she too naive, or did she really not have any feelings for him? Probably, the latter. Rong Juishan smiled bitterly in his heart, but then he calmed himself down and took a deep breath. He pressed his palms on her calves, and a surge of yang qi was transmitted. The yang and yin qi flowed in their bodies, gradually converging and fusing. A faint white light appeared around their bodies, and this white light flowed in the Gu defense shield, making it rounder and rounder, gradually becoming a ball. Now! Rong Juishan shouted, and their bodies suddenly stuck together, their limbs intertwined into a ball, and they rolled forward. Rumble! The Gu defense shield trembled, and really rolled rapidly. Those blood parasite worms could not dodge in time, and were crushed by this ball. There was a faint light in front of them. Ji Xinyu stood on the ground, and the Gu defense shield fell to the ground, like a transparent rain cloth. There was a door behind them, and after they rolled out, the door closed silently, trapping those blood parasite worms inside. On the other side of the door, it was already a dark tunnel, so Ji Xinyu could see her surroundings clearly. The moment they were out of danger, Ji Xinyu's body shot out and separated from Rong Yu Tianlan. Then, she broke the Gu barrier and the two of them were able to see the light of day again. We're free. Once we get out of here, we should be able to reach the place where the sword is hidden, right? Ji Xinyu quickly put away the Gu barrier and asked while looking at the light outside. She stood upright and did not look at Rongyu Yishenlen who was beside her. Rong Yuetian sat there lazily, looked at her, and then looked outside. It should be. Let's go out. Let's go. Ji Xinyu answered simply, and strode towards the light. After taking a few steps, she seemed to realize that something was wrong. She turned around and looked at him, who was still sitting there. Why aren't you walking? Rong Yuetian massaged her legs. My legs are numb, let me slowly. She then looked at her from head to toe. Aren't your legs numb? The difficult movement just now, coupled with the yang and yin force flowing in his legs, made his legs extremely numb and painful, so he was too lazy to stand up. Ji Xinyu shook her head. My legs aren't numb. Her legs were really not numb. Chapter 29-27. Ji Xinyu shook her head. My legs are not numb. Her legs were really not numb. Just now, Rong Yu Yishenlen's palms pressed on her legs and transmitted psychokinesis to her, making her whole body feel warm and comfortable. Therefore, even though it was a difficult action for so long, her legs were still fine. She did not expect that his legs would be numb. It seemed that his flexibility was not as good as hers, even if he was an exalted immortal. Ji Xinyu finally found something that was not as good as her. She felt a little proud and even forgot the awkwardness just now. She hugged her arms and leaned against the wall behind her. She urged him, then hurry up. She decided to wait for him. There was still qi flowing in her body, so she closed her eyes and adjusted her breath. After a while, she seemed to have noticed something and suddenly opened her eyes. Rong Yu Yishenlen was standing in front of her, less than an arm's length away. Ji Xinyu's heart skipped a beat. She subconsciously leaned against the wall and almost stuck to it. Why are you so nervous? Rong Yu Yishenlen chuckled. He pressed one arm on the wall above her head. His dark eyes were deep and unfathomable. Suddenly, he stretched out his other hand to caress her face. Ji Xinyue's body stiffened. She could no longer retreat. She hurriedly raised her hand to block his hand. "Hey! Don't touch me." Before she could finish her sentence, he grabbed her hand. The hand that was supporting the wall twirled a strand of grass from her hair. With a light flick, the grass flew away. Only then did he stop and straighten up. He then looked at her face in surprise. "Why is your face so red?" Ji Xinyue was speechless. She immediately turned around and strode out. "How is my face red? I used too much force just now. It's hot, hot." The figure in front of her blurred. Rongyu Ishinlen appeared directly in front of her. Ji Xinyue almost fell into his arms. She quickly braked and took a step back. "What's wrong with you?" Rongyu Ishinlen looked at her with a faint smile. "Are you going to go out in this outfit? Are you going to expose your identity?" Ji Xinyue then remembered that she had regained her female identity. Of course, the robe she was wearing was still Xinyu's robe. She did not intend to reveal her identity now to avoid being criticized. He hurriedly casted a transformation technique and restored Xinyu's appearance. "Is this okay?" Rongyu Tianlan raised her sleeve and tucked the stray hair on her temples behind her ear. "This will do." His movements were natural and smooth. When his fingertips caressed her skin, there was a familiar fragrance. Ji Xinyu took a step back, then turned around and walked out. Rongyu Tianlan looked at her back, and a deep thought flashed across her eyes. She was still very repulsed by him. When he hugged her and rolled around just now, her body was very stiff and the psychokinesis she transmitted to him was somewhat unstable. He almost suspected that she would send him flying with a kick in the next moment. She looked carefree and didn't care about anything, but the door to her heart was closed very tightly. If he wanted to pry open the door to her heart, it wouldn't be something that could be done in a day. It's been so long. They won't come out. Should we invite the divine sword out now and let it choose its own master? Ji Xinyu had just walked to the entrance of the passage when she heard someone urging impatiently. Then, Yu Shuishang's cold voice sounded, with a habitual sense of superiority. "Actually, I think there's really no need to wait for the others. There's only one divine sword, so it should naturally choose the strongest one. It's most likely that it will choose the first to arrive here, so why wait for the fifth pair?" Chapter 29-28. Then, Yu Shuishang's cold voice sounded, with her usual arrogance. "Actually, I think there's no need to wait for the others. There's only one divine sword, so it should naturally choose the strongest one. It's most likely to be the first to arrive here, so why wait for the fifth pair? Yeah, why don't we start now? Even if the fifth team comes, the chances of them being chosen are extremely small." Someone agreed. "You can't say that the first team to appear is the strongest, right? It's just that the difficulties are different. It doesn't mean that the other teams are inferior to the first team. For example, Immortal Rongyu and Immortal Xinyu's team are the strongest, but they didn't come out either." Someone retorted. "That's different." Yu Shuishang retorted. "Immortal Rongyu and Immortal Xinyu's martial arts are naturally the strongest, but this is the female sword choosing its master. They are only representing Princess Ji Xinyu, not the princess herself, so the divine sword purposely created difficulties for them, making it difficult for them to come out. Unlike us, we are all here in person. The divine sword has seen our true strength, so it will naturally make a judgment. The fact that I'm the first to come out is enough to prove my ability, and also shows the divine sword's love for me." Love? Ha! A woman who stepped on men to get to the top, and then kicked aside after using them, dares to talk about the love of the divine sword? Even if your martial arts are slightly stronger than ours, your character is like that. The divine sword is the embodiment of justice, why would it choose you? That's right, the divine sword's choice is mainly based on overall considerations. The fact that we can come here proves that the divine sword has not abandoned us. There was a lot of chatter outside, everyone expressing their own opinions, basically belittling others to raise their own status, and hoping for a chance for themselves. Ji Xinyue lifted her foot and walked out. Outside was an icy blue snowy peak. The cold wind whistled on the snowy peak, causing the few people who were arguing to shrink back, but the argument was still in full swing. Alright, the fifth team is out. Someone with sharp eyes saw Ji Xinyue and Immortal Xinyu walking out one after another. They were undoubtedly the most controversial team, and the other teams looked at them with complicated expressions. There were originally 13 tunnels leading to this snowy peak, and one tunnel would be closed when a team came out. After Ji Xinyue came out as the last team to pass the selection, all the tunnels on the snowy peak were closed. Faint cries of surprise could be heard from the passageways that had yet to emerge, but they were soon drowned out. Ji Xinyue looked at the Villa Lord of Hidden Sword Manor who was standing on the high platform on the snowy peak. This person stood there like an ice sculpture. No matter how noisy the four groups of people who came out first were, his face was expressionless. Just now, when the four teams came out, they all respectfully greeted him and saluted. He only made a sound of acknowledgement and didn't say another word. Everyone knew that this mountain chieftain had a strange temperament, so no one took his indifference to heart. When Ji Xinyue's team came out, the mountain chieftain let out an almost inaudible sigh of relief. His gaze fell on Rongyue Tianlan. I didn't expect Supreme Deity Rongyue to fall behind. Rongyue Tian replied while twirling the bamboo flute in her hand, this isn't falling behind, it's the finale. The Villa Master of Hidden Sword Manor was speechless. A rare smile appeared on his ice-sculpted face as he nodded slightly. Then, he looked around at the crowd and said, since all of you are here, it means that all of you are valued by the Divine Sword. The Divine Sword has also seen your performance in the tunnel. Chapter 29-29. No one's actions can be hidden from the eyes of the Divine Sword, it has its own decision. As for those who are not chosen, they will be sent down the mountain automatically when the tunnel closes. There will be no accidents. The people below the stage had different expressions when they heard this. Yu Shuishang's face was green and white. Ji Xinyue's heart also thumped. She did not have any ulterior motives, but when she thought of how she and Rongyue Tianlan were carried out and fell into the eyes of the Divine Sword, why did she feel that if she obtained the Divine Sword, it would not be a good thing? Wouldn't it be equivalent to having an extra pair of eyes by her side? Although she was open and aboveboard in her dealings, but she also had her private little space. For example, she had 3 urgent needs. She was deep in thought when her heart suddenly felt like it had been stabbed by something. A line of angry words flashed silently in her mind, this Divine Sword will not be so tasteless. Ji Xinyue. This Divine Sword could read minds. It actually knew what she was thinking in her heart. Ji Xinyue immediately felt a sense of urgency, as if her privacy had been violated. Then shouldn't she give up on this sword? Perhaps when someone else obtained this sword, she could ask the person who obtained it for help. At most, she would pay the price of a little help. It was better than having a pair of eyes by her side that were everywhere. Just as she thought of this, her heart suddenly felt empty. She could not feel the existence of the sword will at all. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the Divine Sword had read her thoughts and became arrogant, so it was no longer interested in her? Well, if it was no longer interested, then so be it. She just happened to have no interest in it. Ji Xinyue heaved a sigh of relief in her heart. She hugged her arms and relaxed her entire body, waiting to see the result. After the Villa Master of the Hidden Sword Manor finished speaking, he took a step back and said, "Now you can invite the divine sword out." The swordsmith beside him responded and immediately took 2 steps towards a large ice pagoda. He lightly patted the ice stone with his palm and quickly retreated. The ice pagoda shook. Before the divine sword appeared, the intense sword will was emitted from the ice pagoda and quickly spread throughout the entire ice mountain. Everyone felt as if they were under heavy pressure, as if there was an invisible mountain hanging in the air, pressing down inch by inch on the people below. Don't use your weapons to fight against it. Once you use your weapons, you will completely activate the sword intent of the divine sword and crush the entire mountain. You can use your telekinesis to resist, or kneel before the divine sword. The voice of the hidden sword Villa master came from another mountain. Naturally, no one dared to draw their weapons. They could only use their psychokinesis to resist. After a while, someone finally couldn't take it anymore and knelt down in front of the ice tower. Strangely enough, after kneeling down, the pressure suddenly disappeared. Ji Xinyu also silently used her telekinesis to resist. Although she didn't want that sword anymore, it didn't mean that she would kneel down and submit to the divine sword. Rongyu Yishanlin stood there. After all, he was an exalted immortal. The sword chi of this sword could not suppress him. He glanced at Ji Xinyu beside him. Her body was as straight as a pine tree, and she looked as if nothing had happened. However, her face was slightly pale. He knew that she had always been strong-willed, so he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, wanting to transfer some of his psychokinesis to help her share the burden. Ji Xinyu, however, took a step to the side and dodged his hand, spitting out 2 words, "No need, I can do it myself." What a strong-willed girl. Rongyu Yishanlin secretly shook his head, but he also admired her in his heart. Chapter 29:30. He could feel the sword will, which was unprecedentedly strong. If it was 2,000 years ago when he was still a god lord, he would have been suppressed by the surging sword will to the point where it would be difficult for him to even take a single step. But this little girl's dodge just now was actually very smooth. It was obvious that she could handle it herself and had the ability to do so. He looked at the others. Among the 5 groups, 2 groups with weaker skills had already knelt down. The other 2 groups were still resisting, but it was very difficult. Their faces were all pale and beads of sweat appeared on their foreheads. Rongyu Yishanlin turned to look at Ji Xinyu again. She pursed her lips slightly and looked at the trembling ice pagoda. Her expression was very calm. Rongyu Yishanlin's eyes flashed and he felt a sense of pride. She was indeed the person he had chosen. She was more outstanding than anyone else. Yu Shuashang was the most beautiful person present, but in Rongyu Yishanlin's eyes, her appearance was not as good as Ji Xinyu's god Lord Xinyu's appearance. She was very pleasing to the eye. No matter what appearance she had, she was very pleasing to the eye. No celestial being could compare to her. Almost everyone's gaze was fixed on the ice peak that was gradually blooming into an ice flower. Only Rongyu Yishanlin's gaze was fixed on Ji Xinyu. He was behind Ji Xinyu. Logically speaking, with her sensitivity, even if she could not see his gaze, she should be able to sense it. But she did not have any reaction. Obviously, she did not have such telepathy. Her attention was not completely on the sword. She even had the leisure to look at the people around her. Then, she watched as the ice pagoda turned into an ice lotus as if she was watching a show. The ice lotus petals bloomed one by one, and in the end, a sword emerged from the center of the lotus. The sword was sealed in the scabbard. The blade of the sword could not be seen. Only the snow-white hilt could be seen. The hilt did not have any luxurious decorations, but it gave off an extremely noble and extraordinary feeling. The entire sword was placed horizontally on the lotus. A faint white light shot out from the sword, making it look even more holy. It was like an ice maiden that could not be profaned. One could only look at it from afar and not touch it. Ji Shinyu looked at the divine sword from head to toe, and then from tail to tip. So that's what the divine sword looks like. It looks especially delicate and slender. No wonder it's called a female sword. Ji Shinyu actually didn't really like small and delicate weapons. For example, she often used a large blade. Every time she swung it, it would create a gust of wind and sweep across everything. Normally, no one would be able to block its edge. How awe-inspiring, how heroic. She secretly touched the machete in her storage space. Although the machete was sharp enough, it was still a mortal weapon. Ji Shinyu had used all kinds of methods to refine it many times before she managed to refine it until it had a little bit of spirituality. If such a weapon fell into the hands of others, it would be destined to be unknown. However, in her hands, it was ranked third in the Fanine continent's weapon chart, becoming the famous Azura divine saber. Just the mention of this saber would make countless experts tremble in fear. That was why it was said that as long as a weapon was sharp enough, it was fine. Only when the owner was strong enough would it be truly powerful. Ever since the saber entered the Hidden Sword Villa's territory, it had been silent. After all, the Hidden Sword Villa had many weapons. Any one of them would be able to suppress this large saber. Ever since this saber followed Ji Shinyu, it had been rather proud because it had won many battles. Even if an ordinary weapon was stronger than it, it would not be convinced. But this time, the divine sword was simply too powerful. It was simply like the ancestor of all weapons. Before it was even born, it had already suppressed everyone to the point that all the weapons with spirituality had restrained their sharpness. Chapter 29:31. It was the same for this saber. It had been suppressed to the point that it was completely silent. When Ji Shinyu's fingers touched the saber's hilt, it seemed to feel that it was being pampered again. It shook slightly, and the hilt even warmed up. Ji Shinyu patted it comfortingly, indicating that she would not abandon it. It immediately felt smug, and shook again. This time, the shaking was more intense, and it directly emitted light. This light even peeked through the storage space. The divine sword that had been lying horizontally on the ice lotus suddenly flashed slightly. The light was extremely faint, and if one did not look carefully, they would not be able to see it. However, the saber in Ji Shinyu's storage space seemed to have suffered a heavy blow, and suddenly shook. Ji Shinyu was closely related to it, and could even feel it make a cracking sound. The saber shook again like a pendulum, and completely stopped moving. The saber was injured. It was injured by the divine sword's invisible sword chi. Ji Shinyu suddenly raised her head and looked at the divine sword. The divine sword was still lying there, arrogant like a high and mighty goddess. Ji Shinyu narrowed her eyes. This thing's domineering aura was not ordinary. This was the first time she saw a sword that could be so arrogant. She touched her saber again. Fortunately, the saber was not heavily injured. She only needed to temper it and protect it with her psychokinesis. This saber did not have any outstanding features, but its biggest advantage was its sturdy skin. No matter what Ji Shinyu used it to chop, it would happily chop it. Even if she used it to chop firewood and cook rice, it would still serve her well. Occasionally, it would be easy to repair, and an ordinary blacksmith would be able to restore it to its original state. The divine sword has been born. Everyone can go up and pull it out. Whoever can pull it out of the scabbard will be its owner. However, I want to remind everyone that this sword has a strong nature. It will test you when you get close, so you must be careful. Also, everyone in the team can go up and try their luck, regardless of gender. The Hidden Sword Mountain Master spoke again. The Hidden Sword Mountain Master's last sentence was like a shot of adrenaline. The eyes of the men who accompanied the woman in were all shining. In particular, the immortal monarch with the king temperament, who had accompanied Yu Shuashang in, could not suppress the joy on his face. This immortal used to be Yu Shuashang's admirer, but his looks and martial arts were not very outstanding, so Yu Shuashang did not pay attention to him at all. This time, Yu Shuashang's true colors were exposed. The immortal and god monarchs who had surrounded Yu Shuashang previously all retreated. No one was willing to partner with her anymore. Yu Shuashang had no choice but to send a telepathic message to the immortal king, promising him some benefits. Only then did the immortal king agree to it. In the tunnel, Yu Shuashang had told him that she would give him the benefits she had promised him after they passed the trial. He told him to risk his life when he encountered danger in the tunnel. He obeyed and fought with his life on the line. However, when he encountered an extremely dangerous situation, he was almost captured by Yu Shuashang and used as a shield. Although he managed to escape the danger by accident, it was enough to make him feel depressed. After exiting the tunnel, Wang Xianjun had completely lost his value in the eyes of Yu Shuashang. In front of him, she resumed her cold beauty and ignored him. The benefits she had promised him had to wait until they went down the mountain. This made him even more depressed, but he could not do anything at the moment. Now that he suddenly heard that he also had the chance to obtain this sword, it was naturally a pleasant surprise. Chapter 29-32. He had already made up his mind. Once he was lucky enough to pull out the sword, he would definitely not give it to Yu Shuashang. He wanted to keep it. With this sword by his side, there would be no lack of beauties throwing themselves at him. Deity by he, we are originally one. If you pull out the divine sword, it should be counted as mine. Don't you think so? Don't worry, if that's the case, I will promise you even greater benefits. I will let you get what you want. Yu Shuashang's cold and charming voice came again. Wang Xianjun chuckled and did not comment. Yu Shuashang was also a little regretful. She regretted that she threw this out a little too early. It would take more effort to redeem herself. Everyone had different thoughts. The men and women who had been through thick and thin together held each other's hands and cheered for each other. Ji Xinyue was very happy to hear this rule. If the divine sword had to choose the person with the best skills and the most popularity, then Rongyu Yishanlan was undoubtedly the best candidate. His chances of getting the sword were higher than anyone else's. If he got the sword, then it would be convenient for her to borrow it, she was thinking in her heart when her fingers were held tightly by someone. She looked up and saw Rongyu Yishanlan's smiling face. I think we should cheer for each other too. Ji Xinyue looked at the other groups. The men and women in the other groups were indeed holding each other's hands. She smiled. Okay, good luck. She patted his shoulder and took the opportunity to pull her hand out. What was going on with two grown men standing here holding hands? They were not homosexuals. Rongyu Yishanlan looked at his empty hand and smiled. However, he put his arm on her shoulder. Are you confident? His action was like men putting their arms around each other's shoulders. His body was almost leaning on her. Ji Xinyue's whole body stiffened. In front of so many people, she could not kick him away. She wanted to quietly avoid him, but his arm was hooked tightly around her. If she did not use her telekinesis, she could not shake him off at all. Let go, men and women should not touch each other. Ji Xinyue secretly gritted her teeth and transmitted her voice to him. You have said this 3 times today. Rongyu Yishanlan chuckled and replied casually, you are now dressed as a man. It is normal for us to do this. No one will say anything. Ji Xinyu. Looks like I can't get rid of this wolf with a gentle attitude. She simply stomped her foot over at lightning speed. Very good, Rongyue Tianlan's foot was stepped on by her. Ji Xinyu knew that his kung fu was high, and if she stepped on him lightly, he would not react at all, so she stepped on him with extra force. After stepping on him, she even used all her strength to crush him. However, Romeo Ishinlin was like a block of wood and did not react at all. Ji Xinhua did not give up and was about to add more strength. Wang Xianjun, who was standing at the front of the group, suddenly screamed and jumped up like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. "My leg!" He furrowed his brows and angrily rebuked Yu Shuashang. Why did you step on my foot?" Yu Shuashang glared at him. "What nonsense are you talking about? When did I step on your foot?" "Just now. There's no one else standing beside me. If you didn't step on me, who else could it be?" Wang Xianjun fumed. The two of them started arguing at the front. Ji Xinhua. Rongyu Ishinlin, this guy actually knows the damage transfer technique. Rongyu Ishinlin still had one arm around her shoulder, while the other gently waved the fan to stop the fight. Chapter 29:33. Rongyu Ishinlin said, "All right, the two of you are in the same group. Why do you have to hurt your friendship over such a small matter? So what if she stepped on you? It's not like you'll lose anything. Wang Xianjun, please be magnanimous and don't lower yourself to her level." Wang Xianjun's face was pale from the pain, but he was still rubbing his foot. She stepped on me too hard. No wonder people say that a woman's heart is the most vicious. He felt that the back of his foot was about to break. Rongyu Ishinlin looked at his foot from a few teams away. His foot was quickly swollen like a bun, and even his boots were full. Rongyu Ishinlin nodded in agreement. Indeed, she was too cruel. It seems that she really didn't give you any face. Ji Xinhua was speechless. This guy was talking about her in a roundabout way. Wang Xianjun saw that this mighty deity was speaking up for him and felt that he was right. He glared at Yu Shuashang angrily. Yu Shuashang was really wrong this time. She argued angrily again, "I didn't step on you." Wang Xianjun hadn't gotten any benefits yet, so he couldn't really fall out with her. He snorted and didn't say anything. Rongyu Ishinlin said again, "All right, you are the first group to come out. You should try your luck first. Which one of you will go first?" Yu Shuashang took a deep breath and said coldly, "Let him go first as compensation." She still couldn't figure out the level of the divine sword and needed someone to test the waters first. Anyway, Wang Xianjun was a little naive. Even if he really got the divine sword, she had ways to snatch it from him. She was happy to do this favor. Wang Xianjun wasn't really naive. He also had his own plans. Regardless of Yu Shuashang's character, her appearance and martial arts were indeed the best among this group of girls. If she went first, the divine sword might really choose her. Then, everyone wouldn't even have a chance to try. This was also good. At least he had a chance. He snorted and didn't say anything. He strode forward. Everyone opened their eyes wide, wanting to see what kind of power the divine sword would unleash. After a while, Wang Xianjun limped up from the ground. He didn't feel good from the fall. He originally thought that even if he couldn't obtain the divine sword, touching the sword hilt would be good enough. However, he didn't expect that, not to mention touching the sword hilt, he didn't even have the luck to get close to it. He had just taken 3 or 4 steps in the direction of the divine sword when he stopped as if he had encountered a great resistance. First, he was choked until his face turned red, and then he flew out like a marionette. He slammed directly onto a large rock. If it wasn't for his thick skin and thick flesh, he probably would have fainted from the fall. He crawled up from the ground with great difficulty, and the divine sword chi he sensed in his heart suddenly broke. Before he could say anything, a large hole opened up under his feet. With a scream, he fell into it and disappeared without a trace. Everyone was shocked. Fortunately, the villa master of the sword-hidden villa explained to them in time, this is a sign that he has been eliminated. Don't worry, he was only invited down the mountain. There won't be any accidents. Only then did everyone heave a sigh of relief. They increasingly felt that this hidden sword villa was not ordinary magical. Fairy Yu, it's your turn. A swordsmith who was in charge of this matter from afar reminded her calmly. Yu Shuashang's face turned pale, but she smiled faintly. I'm afraid that after I make my move, the others won't have a chance. As the saying goes, if it's yours, it won't run away. I can let a few more people go. It won't be too late to make my move after the fourth team makes their move. Chapter 29-34. The others did not say anything, but Ji Xinyu sneered secretly. This Yu Shuashang was not an ordinary schemer. She probably wanted to see how many ways the divine sword could attack people, so she let others take the lead so that she could observe more. Moreover, most of the people in the later groups were not as good as her. She probably thought that the probability of these people being rejected by the divine sword was very high, so she was not too worried that the divine sword would be taken away by the first few groups. Even if someone was lucky enough to catch the eye of the divine sword, as long as their martial arts were not as good as hers, she would probably do everything possible to snatch the sword back from them. In her mind, the strongest opponent was probably Ji Xinyu's group. After all, this group was a strong team, and they were here to fight for the sword for Princess Ji Xinyu. If the divine sword was taken away by these two people, she would have no chance at all. Therefore, she placed herself in front of Ji Xinyu's group to ensure that nothing would go wrong. This woman was able to climb from the lowest level to her current position. She was indeed very scheming everywhere. Ji Xinyu actually did not dislike scheming people. After all, everyone had lived for so many years, and it was impossible for them to become more and more naive. However, she disliked people who frequently stepped on others to get to the top, who had no moral bottom line, and who pretended to be aloof and refined. This Yu Shuashang happened to be in this group. She found her particularly unpleasant to the eye. At this moment, this unpleasant person was standing in front of her. Yu Shuashang stood in front of Ji Xinyu and nodded slightly at her. This was the first time Ji Xinyu was so close to her, and she smelled a very faint orchid fragrance on her body. At first, this fragrance did not feel anything, but after smelling it for a while, she seemed to be getting used to it. She even felt that this was the best and noblest smell in the world, and she wanted to smell it again. Rongyu Yishanlun suddenly pulled Ji Xinyu behind him. Ji Xinyu was not prepared and staggered, almost falling onto his back. She quickly straightened her body and glared at the back of Rongyu Yishanlun, who was half a head taller than her, and had the urge to send him flying with a slap. What was wrong with this guy? Did he think that Yu Shuashang smelled good and wanted to monopolize her? So he pulled her, who was an eyesore, behind him. Ji Xinyu felt that he was being too unkind. Just as she was about to take a step forward, he waved his sleeve at her without even looking back. Ji Xinyu's nose was instantly filled with the faint fragrance of plum blossoms, and she suddenly woke up from her dazed state. Rongyu Yishanlun's voice also entered her ears at the right time. The fragrance on her body is strange. Stay at the back and don't come over. Ji Xinyu was startled, and only then did she realize that her emotions just now were not normal. She was actually almost mesmerized by Yu Shuashang's fragrance, and wanted to run around her. Just now, she even found her extremely pleasing to the eye. Looking at her cold and aloof appearance, she wanted to hug her. Yu Shuashang's body, could it be some kind of special knockout incense? Even she, a woman, was almost mesmerized by her. If those men smelled her scent, it would be even more difficult for them to control themselves. Could it be that her ability to attract bees and butterflies wasn't something she was born with, but rather something she used in her later years? Yu Shuashang did indeed have a very special knockout incense on her body. It smelled like the fragrance of orchids, and gave off the smell of an elegant fairy. However, this knockout incense could stimulate one's nerves. The more one smelled it, the more one wanted to smell it. The more one smelled it, the more one would be mesmerized. Especially for men, it had a special aphrodisiac effect. Of course, it was not an aphrodisiac effect, but an increase in favorability. Chapter 29-35. This was also the main reason why she could become a heartthrob in such a cold and aloof situation. The smell on Yu Shuashang's body was very secretive, only those who were close to her would be charmed by her. At first glance, it was not much different from an ordinary cold fragrance, so it was easy for people to overlook it. Rongyue Tianlan was a famous pharmacist, so naturally, he was also an expert in perfuming. He was originally standing behind Ji Xinyue, so he should not have smelled Yu Shuashang's scent, but his nose was sharp. After smelling it for a while, he realized that something was wrong, so he immediately pulled Ji Xinyue behind him, and stood where Ji Xinyue was just now. At this moment, looking at the graceful woman in front of him, his lips curled into a mocking smile. Using fragrance to charm people? A sparkling pink powder appeared on his fingertips, and then he flicked it lightly. The pink powder was as light as air, and it stained Yu Shuashang's clothes. Then, he took a step back and stood side by side with Ji Xinyue. Ji Xinyue glanced at him. "What are you up to?" "I'm not up to anything, I don't have any other problems, I just like to pull the fox's tail." Rongyue Tianlan rubbed his chin and chuckled. The two of them were talking in a secret language, so no one else could hear them. Ji Xinyue was puzzled, so Rongyue Tianlan leaned on her. "Just wait for the show." Ji Xinyue stepped aside, and her body flashed like a ghost, causing Rongyue Tianlan to lean on nothing. He steadied himself, looked at Ji Xinyue, and sighed. "Xinyue, you're so heartless." This sentence was full of bitterness, coming from this great god's mouth. It made Ji Xinyue shiver. "Great immortal, will you die if you don't feel mushy?" She quickly took 2 steps to the side, so as to avoid being stuck to by him again. Rongyue Tianlan smiled, but did not stick to her again. He was an expert in love, so he knew that he could not stick too close to the woman he loved, so as not to scare her away or arouse her disgust. It was better for him to take it slow. Ji Xinyue quickly understood what Rongyue Tianlan meant by pulling the fox's tail. Because of the man and woman who were originally very close to Yu Shuashang, the man suddenly covered his nose and frowned. "What's that smell?" Then he looked at the woman beside him suspiciously. "What's that strange smell on you? Why is it so smelly?" The woman was immediately furious. "Nonsense. I don't stink." She also wrinkled her nose and suddenly turned around to look at Yu Shuashang behind her. "It's your smell." She suddenly took a step back. What a strong body odor. The man seemed to have figured out the source of the stench. He immediately pulled the woman beside him and retreated a few steps. "It stinks." They stayed far away from Yu Shuashang. Yu Shuashang's expression changed. What's the smell?" "Body odor, you have body odor." The woman's face was filled with disgust. The man beside her didn't want to talk about other people's shortcomings. He pulled the woman forward and said, "Okay, it's our turn." At this moment, Yu Shuashang also smelled the scent on her body, and her face changed greatly. She used to have body odor, but after training, she had obtained a bottle of strange fragrance from an expert in perfumery. She could transform the body odor into a special fragrance that attracted men. However, she did not expect that the strange fragrance would suddenly lose its effect at this moment. Moreover, it caused the body odor on her body to spread out 10 times stronger. Seeing that the remaining few people had disgusted looks on their faces and avoided her, Yu Shuashang wanted to find a hole to hide in. She deeply felt that this place was probably not suitable for her, and her secret was being exposed again and again. Chapter 29:36. She deeply felt that this place was probably not compatible with her. Her secret was being exposed again and again. She had embarrassed herself all the way to her grandmother's house. This made her embarrassed and angry, but she couldn't do anything about it. Ji Xinyue couldn't help but glance at Rongyu Ishanlin. This person's methods were not ordinary when it came to scheming against others. This time, this fairy's reputation would probably really spread far and wide. The two teams in front finally finished their experiments. Just as Yu Shuashang had expected, they all returned in defeat. Basically, before they could even get close to the divine sword, they were bounced off by the sword chi. It was strange, they had clearly failed, but there was no cave to send them away. Instead, they were still standing there, just that they had lost their qualifications. The villa master of the Hidden Sword Manor stood in the distance and explained to these people, the divine sword is more casual. If it doesn't like anyone, it will still throw them down the mountain after they fail. The fact that everyone can still stay here in one piece proves that the divine sword has a good impression of you. Ji Xinyue looked at the divine sword that didn't even move and couldn't help but shake her head. It was really a divine sword that liked to do as it pleased. However, it did have the right to be arrogant. Although those people failed, they were still very happy that they weren't sent away. They stood in another direction and looked at the people who hadn't tried yet. Everyone was curious about who the divine sword would choose. Seeing that only Yu Shuashang, Ji Xinyue and Rongyu Ishanlin were left, everyone's eyes widened, waiting for the final result. Rongyu Ishanlin waved her fan and asked, "Fairy Yu, do you still want to give in this time?" Naturally, Yu Shuashang didn't want to give in. She had already seen through the divine sword's methods and had an idea in her heart. At most, she would be bounced off by the divine sword. It wasn't worth much. She had paid a huge price this time, and her desire to obtain the divine sword was even stronger. After she obtained the divine sword, she would use it to kill all those who humiliated her today. She would let these common people tremble under her skirt and let them know her power. Only by obtaining the divine sword could she get rid of the humiliation today. She took a light breath and walked towards the divine sword. She thought to herself, divine sword, if you acknowledge me as your master, I will definitely make you famous in the world in my hands. You will become the #1 sword in the world. I will give you whatever you want. She knew that the divine sword should be able to read her thoughts, so she desperately made a wish. She walked step by step towards the divine sword, walking cautiously and carefully. She had even forgotten her usual cold demeanor. Strangely, she didn't encounter any obstruction. She could even feel the calling of the divine sword, as if it was calling out to her. When she was only 14 or 15 steps away from the divine sword, she was still able to walk with ease. This was the closest distance that the people in front of him had walked. The most powerful one had been sent flying from this position. As for the others, they were sent flying before they even reached this distance. She did not encounter any obstacles. She walked very smoothly. Yu Shuashang's heart trembled with excitement, and her eyes lit up. Once again, he straightened his chest and looked around at everyone. His eyes were filled with pride. Then, he strode forward. The divine sword did not obstruct her at all, so it definitely wanted to recognize her as its master. This time, he could truly hold his head high. When everyone saw this scene, they were also stunned. Who would have thought that the divine sword would choose her as its master? The divine sword was indeed a person with no moral principles. He only looked at whether a person was beautiful or not, whether their martial arts were high or not, and did not care whether their character was good or not. Chapter 29:37. Disappointment flashed across the crowd's eyes. A hand was placed on Ji Xinyue's shoulder. Rongyue Tianlan had approached her unknowingly. "Are you disappointed?" Ji Xinyue shook her head. As expected. She had already guessed it when Yu Shuashang took the 10th step. The others began to encounter obstacles when they took the 10th step. Only Yu Shuashang did not encounter any obstacles. Did this mean that the divine sword had a special liking for her? Of course, she was disappointed, but Ji Xinyue was not very surprised. No matter how divine the divine sword was, it was still an artifact. It could not be expected to conform to human standards of good and evil. If the sword was taken away by Yu Shuashang, she could only think of other ways to break the meteorite chain. Yu Shuashang finally reached out to the divine sword. Just as her snow-white fingertips were about to touch the hilt of the divine sword, a sudden change happened in an instant. A snow-white cold light burst out from the sword. The cold light was extremely bright and dazzling. Yu Shuashang was caught off guard and blinked subconsciously. Then, she felt a sudden pain in her right arm. Blood spurted out, and a snow-white mass flew out. This change was too fast, so fast that she did not even have time to scream. She subconsciously took a step back. Only then did she see that the snow-white mass that flew out was her arm wrapped in her sleeve. Her right arm had been cut off from the shoulder. It was not until blood spurted out from the cut that Yu Shuashang finally reacted. She let out a shrill cry and finally felt pain. She had probably never experienced such pain in her life. She took a few steps back and sealed her acupoints with trembling hands. Before her fingers touched her shoulder, another white light burst out and flashed past her left shoulder. As a result, her left arm also flew out with a spray of blood. She screamed and lost her balance. Her body fell backward. A big hole appeared in the ground. Her whole body fell into it. With a scream, she fell straight down and disappeared in an instant. The ground closed and the big hole disappeared. Even Yu Shuashang's 2 broken arms disappeared without a trace. It was unknown whether they fell with Yu Shuashang or fell to another exit at the foot of the mountain. Even the blood on the snowy ground disappeared after a flash of white light. It was as if this tragedy had never happened. Almost everyone was stunned. Everyone stared blankly at this scene, unable to close their gaping mouths. It turned out that the godly sword did not only have the ability to send people flying, it could actually cut off people's arms without being unsheathed. What's more, he didn't expect it to be so ruthless towards the number 1 beauty. First, he gave her hope. He didn't reject her approach, but when she was full of hope, he gave her the most fatal blow. After Yu Shuashang fell down, even if she didn't bleed to death, she would become a real cripple. Her tragic end was already destined. Not only was this divine sword ruthless, it was also two-faced. Ji Xinyu looked at the sword lying there, her fingers slowly clenching. Now that only she and Rongyue Tianlan were left, she was bound to make this trip. She could no longer sense the aura of the divine sword. It was obvious that it had given up on her and would not recognize her as its master. It seemed that the master it recognized was Rongyue Tian, or perhaps only Rongyue Tian could truly subdue it. Rongyue Tian's gaze also fell on the sword. Her expression was rarely solemn. Suddenly, she took her hand and walked forward. "I'll go with you." Chapter 29:38. Xinyu paused. "Aren't we going one by one?" Rongyue Tianlan smiled. "I'm not against the 2 of us going together. You go and pull out the sword first. If you can't do it, I'll do it." Pulling her forward, he said, "All right, it's a happy deal. Don't dawdle." The surrounding onlookers widened their eyes. Everyone could tell that Heavenly Immortal Rong-Yu's attitude towards Heavenly Lord Xin-Yu was rather ambiguous. This was because men rarely held hands. Sir God Xin-Yu seemed to be unwilling and he looked like he wanted to kick the other party away, but he couldn't be too rude in front of so many people. Everyone had heard about Rong-Yu and knew about the grudge between him and Ji Xinyue. Now that they saw this, they could not help but guess. Could it be that this Heavenly Immortal Rong-Yu was a homosexual and he liked this Heavenly Lord Xin-Yu? Was that why he broke off the engagement with Princess Ji Xinyue with such fanfare? After breaking off the engagement, the two of them might have felt sorry for Princess Ji Xinyue, so they came here to snatch the divine sword and wanted to give it to Princess Ji Xinyue as compensation. The more the crowd thought about it, the more they felt that this was the truth. After all, Xinyue was famous for not being interested in women. He had never been seen in any brothel. As for Heavenly Immortal Rong-Yu, she immediately broke off her great marriage and came to play with Xinyue. After the crowd guessed this truth, the interaction between the two of them became more and more subtle. It seemed more and more like they were gay. This mainland did not discriminate against gay people. After all, everyone was immortal cultivators. The path to immortality was long and boring. It was not bad to have a companion by your side. Love between a man and a woman was good, but it might even be true love. Moreover, the couple in front of them looked so pleasing to the eye. The crowd had all kinds of guesses. Ji Xinyue naturally did not know that the crowd had already thought of her relationship with Rong-Yu Tianlan. At this moment, all her thoughts were on the divine sword. She did not want the sword to recognize her as its owner. She wanted to prevent it from attacking her. When she and Rong-Yu Tianlan walked towards the divine sword, they did not meet with any obstacles. When they were 5 steps away from the divine sword, Rong-Yu Tianlan stopped and finally let go of Ji Xinyue's hand. "You go first." Ji Xinyue nodded and strode over. Until now, she had not sensed the call of the divine sword. This fellow allowed her to come close, perhaps it also had the intention of slashing her. However, she was not Yu Shuashang. If it wanted to plot against her, it would have to pay a price. She knew she couldn't get the sword, and she didn't want to get it. The only reason why she came here was because she had already come this far. If she left without trying, others might think that she was afraid of the sword. She reached her hand out to the divine sword. Rong-Yu Ishanlan, who was a few steps away, secretly pinched a spell in her sleeve to prevent the divine sword from harming people. However, he and Ji Xinyue were obviously overthinking things. The sword lay there quietly. When Ji Xinyue's fingers touched the hilt, it still didn't react. What's wrong with this guy? The sword spirit inside was being suppressed. Ji Xinyue didn't notice anything wrong, so she had no choice but to draw her sword. Swoosh! A sword as cold as ice was unsheathed. It went so smoothly that even Ji Xinyue herself was stunned. Of course, the people who were staring at her nervously were also stunned. Everyone's jaws dropped at the same time. Chapter 29-39. So straightforward. So smooth. She actually didn't encounter any obstacles, nor did she encounter any attacks. Ji Xinyue pulled out this sword as if it were an ordinary sword, causing her to be nervous for so long for nothing. That feeling was like using all her strength to chop down a large rock, only to find that the rock was a soft piece of tofu. It made her feel like her waist had been shaken. Her gaze fell on the blade, and she narrowed her eyes slightly. The blade was 2 feet and 8 inches long, as if it was made of ice and snow, with a hint of icy blue in the snow white. The blade was sharp, and under the sunlight, it shone with a rainbow luster. It was magnificent but also exuded a cold murderous aura. Ji Xinyue had seen many divine weapons in her life, delicate, mysterious, rough, and all kinds of special characteristics. But she had never seen such an aura as contradictory and strange. This sword was very beautiful, unprecedentedly beautiful. Whether it was the blade or the hilt, every inch of it revealed one word: perfection. Ji Xinyu had never thought of using the word beautiful to describe a sword, but the moment she saw the full appearance of this sword, this was the first word that appeared in her mind. Such a beautiful sword, but its aura was extremely powerful, as if it was a proud queen looking down on all living things, not allowing anyone to violate it. Ha ha ha, are you surprised? A line of words suddenly flashed in Ji Xinyue's mind. At the same time, Ji Xinyue finally felt the sword intent of the divine sword. It was very turbulent and very cheerful. It was as if the sword was laughing proudly. Ji Xinyue. She replied with an ellipsis. You are indeed surprised. I find that you really don't want me. The divine sword wrote another line of words. That's right. Ji Xinyue replied with 2 words. Humph, I knew it. I can read minds. The divine sword wrote proudly. Then why did you choose me? Ji Xinyue expressed her confusion. This divine sword likes challenges, and this divine sword has the final say in who the master of this divine sword is. No one has the right to refuse or interfere. Similarly, since I have chosen you, you have no right to refuse. The divine sword said proudly. It had a look of, I just like to see you not like me but can't do anything to me. These words were so annoying. Ji Xinyu narrowed her eyes. Is that so? With a flip of her wrist, she was about to throw the divine sword out. Suddenly, she felt a wave of extremely cold air pass through the sword hilt and into her palm. It instantly swam into her blood vessels, causing all the blood vessels in her body to almost freeze. It was her instinct to save herself in danger, so Ji Xinyue immediately channeled her internal energy to resist. She used her telekinesis to intercept the cold air that was flowing towards her. The 2 of them fought and clashed inside her body. It was as if 2 powerful cultivators were fighting inside. Ji Xinyu stood there, seemingly motionless, but her face suddenly turned red and white, and the veins on her hand that was holding the divine sword faintly bulged. Rongyue Tianlan frowned, her figure flashed, and she was about to step forward to help. However, the secret message from the sword concealment villa stopped him in time. At this moment, Ji Xinyue had no time to pay attention to her surroundings. She was trying her best to push the cold qi out, inch by inch, through her blood vessels, forcing it back into her palm. Swoosh! Ji Xinyu finally let out a sigh of relief as she finally forced out the cold qi. This scoundrel wanted to show her who was the boss, but she was not going to fall for it. However, as the cold qi leaked out, a few drops of blood were also forced out from her palm. Chapter 2940. Strangely enough, the moment the blood was forced out, it did not condense in her palm. Instead, it was eaten by the sword, disappearing without a trace. A line of blood flowed from the hilt into the blade, all the way to the tip. The sword was originally snow white with a hint of light blue, but now there was a dazzling red line, as if a plainclothed beauty had added a crimson belt to her waist. It was shockingly beautiful. It's a success. The divine sword said again. Ji Xinyue's heart tightened. What's a success? Congratulations, Princess Xinyue. The divine sword has recognized you as its master. From today onwards, it's yours. The voice of the hidden sword manor master came from afar, his voice full of gratification. Ji Xinyue froze. Princess Xinyue. Her identity was exposed. She looked down subconsciously and saw herself reflected on the sword blade. She took a deep breath. She did not know when she had regained her original appearance. Although she was still wearing Sir God Xinyu's clothes, her face was her own. Flowing black hair, jade-like skin, watery eyes, captivating red lips, Ji Xinyue's face was extremely beautiful. Once she regained her original appearance, it was obvious that she was a girl. No matter how beautiful a man was, he could not look like her, so it was useless even if she was still wearing men's clothes. She glanced at the people around her. Almost everyone's eyes fell on her face, their expressions varied. Some were surprised, some thought that it was so, and some were jealous. So Sir God Xinyu is Princess Xinyue. Why didn't I think of that? They are the same person. Xinyu. Xinyue. Their names are similar. So Princess Xinyue is not so introverted that she can't meet people. She has been wearing men's clothes in the Jianghu and has made such a name for herself. This is too surprising. If this news spreads, it will cause a sensation in the entire Fanine continent. Everyone's discussion was endless. Obviously, the fact that Sir God Xinyu was Princess Xinyue had shocked them greatly. Ji Xinyue glanced at Rongyu Yishanlin beside her, but his gaze fell on the divine sword in her hand, as if he was thinking of something. At first, Ji Xinyue thought it was Rongyu Yishanlin's doing. After all, he was the only one who could restore her original appearance without anyone noticing. But now, her gaze fell on the divine sword. You're the one behind this. Her tone was somewhat unfriendly. The tip of the divine sword flashed with white light, as if a child's prank had finally succeeded. Not bad. How can my master hide his head and show his tail? I want everyone to understand that I chose a woman, and not a man, and I can't let people say that my divine sword made a choice without seeing the person. Ji Xinyu's finger gently stroked the edge of the sword, a faint smile on her face. How do you know that I must have you? This guy had exposed her true identity without her consent. He was simply too willful. It was fine if she could control such a divine sword well, but if she couldn't control it well, she was afraid that it would backfire on her master. She didn't want it. You're right to be worried. I only follow the strong. The divine sword seemed to have finally opened its chatterbox and was able to communicate with others. That's why you must continue to become stronger. Continue to become stronger so that you won't trigger my backlash. Ji Xinyu raised her hand and threw it out. No need, I can abandon you right now. The divine sword turned into a shooting star and was directly thrown off the mountain peak. Everyone was fighting to get this sword, and when they saw this sword ancestor, they couldn't wait to worship her. Chapter 2941. The princess actually threw it away. Threw it away. It was such a waste of resources. It was too unbelievable. Even the villa master of Hidden Sword Villa changed his expression. Ever since this sword was forged, all sorts of strange phenomena had occurred. It had exploded the sword-casting furnace and destroyed the sword-forging room. No matter what, it could not be forged into the shape that the swordsmith wanted. Even the length and shape of the blade could not be controlled. In the end, on the day it took shape, it took the lives of all the swordsmiths in the room. On the day it took shape, Sword-Casting Peak was automatically covered in ice and snow. No creatures were allowed to come close within a radius of 10 miles. Anyone who came close would be killed without mercy. What was even worse was that this sword was extremely aggressive. Ever since it was formed, the top-quality weapons in the Hidden Sword Villa had suffered a calamity. As long as it smelled the slightest scent, it would automatically come to the door and cut the opponent in half. There were originally hundreds of divine weapons stored in the treasure pavilion of the Hidden Sword Villa, but in the end, they were completely destroyed by it in a single day. When Hidden Sword Mountain's Villa Master found it, he only saw a mess. Hidden Sword Mountain's Villa Master was so heartbroken that he almost vomited blood. When he looked up, he saw this thing hanging in the air arrogantly and writing lines of words on the wall. It's time for this divine sword to choose its master. in the thousands of years since Hidden Sword Villa's establishment, this was the first time they were forced by a sword. It was also the first time a sword set the rules for choosing its master. Before it left, it even took the sword at the villa master's waist. It was said that it was a piece of scrap metal and it was annoyed just looking at it. How was this forging a divine sword? It was simply inviting a living ancestor. Hidden Sword Villa had 365 swordsmiths. All of them were top-notch and were sword fanatics. They were obsessed with forging swords every day. Even if the swords they forged were not divine swords, they were still rare treasures in this world. Because there were many swordsmiths, Hidden Sword Villa had swords formed almost every day. However, ever since this divine sword was formed, Hidden Sword Villa could no longer forge another sword. This was because every sword would be destroyed by this thing as soon as it was formed, only leaving a ground of scrap metal for the swordsmiths, causing them to beat their chests and stomp their feet. Hidden Sword Villa's villa master never thought that a sword could be such a disaster, so in the end, he did whatever it wanted. He only wanted to send this living ancestor away as soon as possible. Those who had passed just now all returned in defeat. The Hidden Sword Villa's villa master remained calm on the surface, but his heart was still trembling with fear. He was afraid that the divine sword heart was too high and would not choose a master among these people, continuing to stay in the Hidden Sword Mountain Villa to cause trouble. Therefore, when he saw that the divine sword had recognized Ji Shinyu as its master, he heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that he had finally found a husband for the sword ancestor and could send it off with a bang, but he never thought that Ji Shinyu would actually not want it. He even threw the sword out in a very dashing manner. To be honest, seeing the divine sword suffer, the Hidden Sword Villa's villa master actually felt quite relieved. However, he knew very well how crafty this divine sword was. Now that he had been thrown out in public by Ji Shinyu, he would definitely feel embarrassed. Who knew what kind of waves he would stir up? Princess, this sword can't be offended. The Hidden Sword Villa's villa master hurriedly said. Before he could finish his sentence, a loud rumbling sound came from below. The ground beneath his feet trembled. Heavens! The mountain is going to collapse. The people standing at the edge of the cliff cried out in alarm. Everyone, leave quickly. Hidden Sword Villa's villa master shouted in alarm. Chapter 2942. Everyone, leave quickly. Hidden Sword Villa's villa master shouted in alarm, and took the lead to fly up with the swordsmiths beside him. The earth was rumbling, the mountain rocks were collapsing, and the snow was flying. The mountain peak that everyone was standing on was cut in half by the divine sword, and the entire mountain peak collapsed. It was as if the end of the world had arrived, only the collapse of the mountain peak could be seen, and almost nothing else. One sword. Just one sword. One sword destroyed a mountain peak. This was the power of the divine sword. Fortunately, everyone who was standing on the mountain peak could fly, and rose into the air in time, so they didn't die with the mountain peak. However, this earth-shattering aura frightened everyone present. After the divine sword destroyed the mountain peak, it directly flew up. It hovered in front of everyone and buzzed. The sword's body was dazzling, and the sword's chi covered the entire sky like dark clouds, as if it was enraged and was ready to attack these people. Almost everyone present was an expert among experts, and any one of them was a well-known figure in the Sanine continent. However, under the deterrence of this sword, their faces turned pale. They subconsciously pulled out their weapons, but these weapons that were usually very powerful were now like mice that saw a cat, trembling in the hands of their owners. Some even refused to unsheath, and no matter how their owners urged them, they didn't dare to move. Everyone felt the murderous aura of the sword, and those with weaker skills couldn't help but tremble. They all looked at Hidden Sword Villa's villa master, wanting to see what the divine sword's creator had in mind. Hidden Sword Villa's villa master had no choice, and could only look at Ji Xinyue and Rongyu Yishinlin with hope. Of course, he was mainly looking at Rongyu Yishinlin. After all, the other party was an exalted immortal, and he was experienced and knowledgeable. Perhaps he would have an idea. Rongyu Yishinlin, on the other hand, was very carefree and calm. He twirled a bamboo flute in his hand and looked at Ji Xinyue beside him. "Do you need me to make a move?" Ji Xinyue stared at the sword and shook her head decisively. "No need. I can do it myself." She leapt up and flew straight towards the overbearing divine sword. At this time, the sword had become much bigger and longer, and stood there like a huge dragon bearing its fangs and brandishing its claws. Ji Xinyu standing in front of it was like a little white rabbit standing in front of an elephant. Especially after Ji Xinyue flew over, the sword seemed to be even more excited. The light was like a small sun, and the sword chi was even more biting cold. The surrounding clouds were torn apart by the sword chi, and the airflow was like a tsunami. Everything that came close to it was instantly turned into dust. Although everyone knew that Ji Xinyu's martial arts were very high, in this situation, everyone was worried for her. In particular, the villa master of the Hidden Sword Villa clenched his sleeves tightly. He could already tell that this divine sword was truly enraged. It even had the heart to devour its master. If Ji Xinyu was no match for it, she would most likely be injured by it. Once he was injured by it, the newly established blood contract would be automatically dissolved. This sword would become ownerless again. It was so ferocious. After this incident, once such a bad reputation was spread, who would dare to have ideas about it in the future? Then, wouldn't it be unable to find its master and continue to wreak havoc in the sword-hidden villa? With this sword's temperament, if no one subdued it, it might directly become a sword demon and stir up a storm of blood in the Sanskrit continent. When the villa master of Hidden Sword Villa thought of this, his head swelled up. Chapter 2943. When Hidden Sword Villa's villa master thought of this, his head couldn't help but swell. A layer of cold sweat formed on his forehead. He really wanted to remind Rongyu Yishinlin to pay attention to the divine sword's movements. It would be best if he could directly think of a way to subdue the divine sword. However, he didn't dare to say it out loud. If the divine sword heard him, his Hidden Sword Villa would probably be razed to the ground. He was so anxious that he couldn't help but look at Rongyu Yishinlin again and again. This ascended immortal was truly able to keep his composure, standing there without moving. Ji Xinyue stood in front of the divine sword, her clothes fluttering like the tide, but she was as still as a mountain. She looked up at the sword, her lips moving, as if she was communicating with the sword, but no one could hear what she was saying. Hidden Sword Villa's villa master's heart skipped a beat. The airflow within a radius of half a mile around the sword was extremely strong, and everyone could almost see the surging sword intent. They knew that under such airflow, even a blade made of diamond could be broken and destroyed by this airflow. However, Ji Xinyu, this delicate and timid woman, was standing in front of the divine sword. Other than her clothes fluttering a little, she didn't see anything wrong with her. Her expression was even cold and calm, as if she was standing in an ordinary place. Just from this move, everyone understood that this Princess Ji Xinyu's skills were truly unfathomable. Other than immortal Rongyue, who hadn't made a move yet, no one present could last more than 10 moves in front of her. When those women saw that the divine sword had recognized Ji Xinyu as its master, they were a little unconvinced. They felt that she was only relying on her identity, or perhaps Rongyu Yishinlin's light, which was why she had such good luck. But now that they saw Ji Xinyu reveal such strength, they had no choice but to be convinced. This princess relied on her own abilities. Not to mention the people present, even Fairy Xuechang couldn't compare to her. No matter when, the strong were the easiest to convince. Ji Xinyu hadn't even officially made a move, but she had already won the sincere admiration of everyone. After watching for a moment, Hidden Sword Villa's Villa Master finally saw that Ji Xinyu was indeed communicating with the Divine Sword, and was not pretending. His heart skipped a beat, and his eyes widened. After the Divine Sword was forged, the only person who could barely communicate with it was him, the Villa Master. No one else could. But now, Ji Xinyu seemed to be chatting happily with it. Could it be because of the blood contract between them? Ji Xinyu was indeed conversing with this divine sword. After this divine sword was thrown out by her, it seemed to be extremely angry. In her mind, the general meaning was that it was a dignified divine sword, and only it could abandon people. No one could be disrespectful to it, otherwise it would be blasphemy and so on. Ji Xinyu expressed her disdain towards its double standards. After exchanging a few words with it, she was unable to convince it, so she simply pulled out her saber and laughed. Dignity is something you fight for yourself, not something you scare. This princess doesn't like to talk nonsense. Let's fight. If you win, you can do whatever you want to me. If I win. She paused for a moment. The divine sword immediately replied, "You win, I officially recognize you as my master." Ji Xinyu sneered, "It's not easy to recognize me as your master. You have to get my permission first. I'm not the type to blindly accept things." The divine sword seemed to have suffered a blow. It paused for a moment before asking, "Then what will happen if you win?" Chapter 2944. Do me a favor. After this, you'll still be free to choose another master. Ji Xinyu stated her conditions. The divine sword's light flickered as it repeated, "By then, I'll be able to choose my master." "Yes. I won't interfere, nor will I stop you." "Alright, deal." The divine sword buzzed and flew straight up into the sky. "Come on. Let me see what you're capable of." It sounded like an elder giving pointers to a younger generation. Ji Xinyu almost laughed. She didn't say anything else and flew up like a bolt of lightning. One sword and one person faced each other in the air. The tip of the sword was pointed at Ji Xinyu, overflowing with murderous intent. Ji Xinyu waved her hand in the air and two swords appeared out of thin air, one red and one white. There seemed to be a raging fire on the red sword, while there seemed to be ice and snow on the white sword. She had used the fire element and water element in the air to condense them. They might not be divine weapons, but they were sharp enough. Everyone looked up from below, and when they saw Ji Xinyu making these two swords, they were somewhat puzzled. Xinyu's famous weapon was the Azura saber. There was even a saying in the Fanine continent, "When Azura appears, ghosts and gods weep." It was obvious how powerful and famous that saber was. This divine sword was obviously not easy to deal with. Even if Ji Xinyu used all her strength, she might not be its opponent. Everyone thought that she would definitely use the saber, but they didn't expect her to casually condense two swords. In the Fanine continent, as long as one cultivated to the level of a god, it was very common for them to casually condense weapons. However, to deal with a divine weapon like the divine sword, shouldn't one use the most suitable weapon? Ji Xinyu had underestimated her opponent too much. The Hidden Sword Villa's Villa Master clenched his fists so tightly that his finger bones almost broke. He couldn't help but complain to Rongyu Yishanlin, "Immortal, is Princess Xinyu? Is she underestimating her opponent too much?" Rongyu Yishanlin's gaze also fell on Ji Xinyu's two swords, but her eyes flashed with admiration. "She's very smart. Hidden Sword Manor Lord." Was this arrogance? The divine sword was also buzzing, it was also angry at being looked down upon. "You're not going to pull out your broken blade?" It was the ancestor of weapons, so it could easily see all the weapons on Ji Xinyu's body. The only thing that caught his eye on her was the knife. As for the divine sword, it had also disliked that saber for a long time. Of course, in the eyes of the divine sword, all the weapons in the world were not up to standard. Saying that it was a lousy blade was already praising the blade. Normally, it would call other weapons scrap metal. Ji Xinyu's Azura blade was actually very afraid of this divine sword. Compared to this divine sword, it was simply unsightly. When the divine sword wanted to recognize Ji Xinyu as its master, the Azura saber felt a sense of danger. He felt that it was over. Its position had been replaced. It was very indignant and full of self-pity. It even felt like it had given up on itself. Ji Xinyu and the divine sword were about to fight, and the Azura saber immediately felt a sense of solemnity. It felt that its master would definitely use it, so its chance to fight for its master had arrived. It wanted to fight. Rather than being abandoned and ignored in the future, it might as well fight for its master now. Even if it was cut into scrap metal by the divine sword and completely destroyed, it was still better than hiding in the storage space and rusting. Now that it had been named, it felt even more solemn and stirring. It desperately used its spiritual force to influence Ji Xinyu in the storage space. Master, use me. Master, let me out. Chapter 29:45. Ji Xinyu naturally sensed the Azura saber's excitement. She held the two swords in one hand and patted it with the other. Be good, you don't need to fight now. I can't let anything happen to you. If she pulled out this saber, she would definitely be cut into pieces by this divine sword. This saber had been with her for thousands of years and had long since developed feelings for it. She did not want to risk it. Furthermore, this battle really did not need it to fight. The Azura saber was moved. Master did not give up on it. Master was still as good to it as before. Master was really too good. She was worth it for it to risk its life for her. But the divine sword was angry. The sword shadow spun and countless swords appeared around it. Countless sword shadows spread out in the sky, filling the sky with killing intent. I will make you pay for underestimating the enemy this time. The sword shadows were like a tide, shooting towards Ji Xinyu's face. This divine sword actually knows the shadow division technique. Heavens, this sword has already become a spirit. The spectators below cried out in surprise. One must know that the shadow division technique could only be used when the weapon's master reached the high level of divine monarch. No matter how powerful a weapon was, it still needed a truly powerful master to use it to unleash its power. And this sword knew such a profound technique by itself. It was truly heaven-defying. Everyone was excited and nervous at the same time, all of them holding their breaths. Ji Xinyu's body swayed and everyone's eyes blurred. Countless Ji Xinyu appeared in the sky. Every Ji Xinyu faced a divine sword. Shadow division technique against shadow division technique. The divine sword and human figures intertwined in the sky, and from time to time, the sound of beams exploding could be heard. This kind of battle was truly too rare. Everyone was dazzled, but they did not dare to blink, afraid that they would miss something. Ji Xinyu's method of dealing with the divine sword was very simple. Every one of her clones had a red sword in their right hand with raging flames, directly burning the divine sword. After burning for a while, the ice sword in their left hand directly spat out a pillar of water. Her method of fighting was very effective. The divine sword's clones, after alternating between hot and cold attacks, were directly blown away. Originally, the divine sword's clones were exactly the same as its main body. When they were flying, no one could tell which was the clone and which was the main body. But after a quarter of an hour, those divine sword clones had all disappeared, leaving only one sword in the air, unscathed. The swords in Ji Xinyu's hands that were fighting against this sword had already been destroyed. They were directly cut into countless pieces by the sword qi on the sword in a single exchange. However, even though it was cut off quickly, Ji Xinyu was not slow either. Just as the two swords were destroyed, she immediately condensed two identical swords. You can actually see through my true form. The divine sword's voice rang in Ji Xinyu's mind. Ji Xinyu's lips curled up. To her, this was not difficult at all. However, the divine sword's next words caused the smile that had just appeared on Ji Xinyu's face to disappear in an instant. As expected of the master that this divine sword has chosen. This divine sword has discovered that you are a promising talent. Ji Xinyu didn't want to waste any more time with it. With a wave of her hands, countless shadow clones gathered and surrounded the divine sword from all directions. Beat it up. This was Ji Xinyu's short order. Boom boom boom, hua hua hua, countless tongues of fire shot towards the divine sword, enveloping the divine sword in a sea of fire. After burning fiercely for a while, waves of water turned around and splashed towards the divine sword that had almost been burned red by the heat like a tidal wave. Everyone finally understood why Ji Xinyu did not use the Azura saber, but used this kind of sword instead. Chapter 2946. No matter how divine the divine sword was, it was still a sword. A sword had the characteristics of metal. If it was a rock, it would have exploded countless times. Even if it was a divine sword, it would still be damaged, right? One sword and one person attacked in the air like a whirlwind. This time, the divine sword did not use the shadow clone technique, it directly attacked. Countless rays of light shot out from its body, shooting towards Ji Xinyu in the air. Those rays of light were too sharp, too fierce. When they shot out, the sharp whistling sound was shocking. Ji Xinyu's shadow clones were hit by the divine sword's rays from time to time, turning into gas and disappearing. Hidden Sword Villa's Villa Master's heart jumped for half a day, afraid that Ji Xinyu's real body would also turn into gas and disappear after being hit. After all, Ji Xinyu's real body and clones were exactly the same. It was impossible to tell them apart with the naked eye. Moreover, the divine sword shot out too many rays of light, like fireworks. Seeing Ji Xinyu's clones explode and disappear in the air, the Villa Master felt his heart tighten and contract. He was so nervous that he couldn't breathe. If her real body was hit, even if she didn't turn into gas and disappear, she would probably be seriously injured, right? If that was the case, the Villa Master didn't dare to think further. The battle in the air was too fast. The sky was filled with shadows of swords and people. He was a little dizzy, and couldn't see who had the upper hand in the battle. He turned his gaze to Rongyu Yishanlin. Rongyu Yishanlin's gaze was also fixed on the sky. Although there was no expression on his face, he still looked very calm, without any worry. Hidden Sword Villa's Villa Master secretly heaved a sigh of relief. This immortal and Princess Ji Xinyu were one. If she was going to be defeated, he should be very anxious, right? Now that he was so calm, it should be because Princess Ji Xinyu had the upper hand. In fact, after watching for a while, everyone was a little dizzy. Some of the weaker ones even vomited. In the end, no one dared to look at the person and the sword in the battle anymore. Instead, they looked at Rongyu Yishanlin to analyze who had the upper hand in this battle from his facial expression. Rongyu Yishanlin, who was watching the battle, suddenly had a faint white light at his waist. He frowned slightly and touched his waist, taking out a silver-white sound transmission talisman. He casually opened it. A moment later, he turned off the voice transmission talisman, turned around, and flew to the side of the Hidden Sword Villa's Villa Master. Villa Master, may I have a word with you? Everyone was quite far away. They only saw Rongyue Tianlan and the Manor Lord of Hidden Sword Manor whispering something. The Manor Lord looked at the battle in the sky reluctantly and then quickly followed Rongyue Tianlan. The two figures disappeared very quickly, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Everyone left. Exalted immortal Rongyu left just like that. Princess Ji Xinyue was still fighting for her life against that divine sword. Didn't he care a lot about this princess? Why did he choose to leave at this time? One had to know that the battle above was getting more and more dangerous. Almost every moment was extremely dangerous. If he really cared about her, even if he didn't help her, he would at least protect her without blinking, right? Why did he suddenly leave? Could it be that the rumors were true? That this heavenly immortal Rongyu only felt guilty towards Princess Ji Xinyue, and only wanted to help her obtain the divine sword. Once he achieved his goal, he would leave without any reluctance? Regarding Rongyue Tianlan's departure midway, everyone was speculating in their hearts. There were almost 100 melodramatic versions of it. Chapter 2947. Ji Xinyu, who was fighting in the air, also paused for a moment. In this short pause, her arm was hit by a ray of white light from the divine sword. Fortunately, she woke up in an instant and dodged in time. The white light brushed past her arm and cut off a piece of her flesh, but did not hurt her bones. Blood gushed out, but she did not care. She sealed her acupuncture points at lightning speed, focused her mind, and continued to fight with the divine sword. When one person and one sword fought, the momentum was extremely shocking. Fortunately, they were in the air. If they were on the ground, the entire Hidden Sword Manor would have been completely destroyed. This divine sword was indeed a heaven-defying spiritual object. Its spiritual chi was astonishing, but it had just been formed not long ago. It had little experience, and the moves it knew were limited. After fighting with it for 100 moves, Ji Xinyu had basically figured out its moves, and would not be hurt by it again. The only thing that gave her a headache was that this sword was unprecedentedly tough, and especially resistant to beatings. She refined it with fire and water for a long time, and it actually became brighter and sharper. What made Ji Xinyu not know whether to laugh or cry was that this sword was extremely smart, and it could learn and use it. It had actually been observing her swordsmanship. As long as it saw her use it a few times, it would be able to use it properly, and turn around to deal with her. It was very proud of itself during the fight. How does it feel to be attacked by your own moves? Ji Xinyu pursed her lips, and did not even bother to give it any response. The divine sword could not even detect what she was thinking. Her mentality had always been very stable. No matter what words it used to provoke her, it could not anger her. Instead, it made her attack more and more ruthless. Of course, there was only one time when her emotions wavered, and that was when Rongyue Tianlan left. So much so that it found an opportunity to hurt her. However, because her emotions wavered for too short a time, she quickly adjusted herself, and it could not find another chance. The divine sword was actually very happy. The longer it fought with Ji Xinyu, the more moves it learned. Then, it used all of them on Ji Xinyu, letting her have a taste of the fun of using one's own spear to attack one's own shield. After fighting for nearly 2 hours, Ji Xinyu's forehead was slightly sweaty, but the sword was getting brighter and brighter. After all, a person's physical strength was limited, but the divine sword, it was like a small motor with an electric circuit, and did not know fatigue at all. You are no match for me. I am the only divine weapon in the world. But for you to be able to resist me for so long, that's already pretty good. If you admit defeat, I won't do anything to you. The longer we fight, the more moves I'll learn from you. You won't be able to deal with me then. Why don't you stop while you're ahead? Hey! Why aren't you saying anything? Have you turned mute from fighting? This sword repeatedly flashed through Ji Xinyue's mind. Ji Xinyue finally spoke. If I admit defeat, what will you do to me? The little girl finally couldn't hold on any longer. Admit defeat. The divine sword immediately said proudly, if you lose, you can recognize me as your master, and I will still help you with whatever you need. Ji Xinyu smiled. That sounds pretty good. Of course, my divine sword cherishes talents very much. However, there is one thing that I want to make clear. My servants are not allowed to carry other weapons. Throw away that broken blade of yours. Or let me just destroy it. The divine sword was still thinking about destroying her blade, bringing with it a sinister aura. The Azura saber trembled in the storage space. Chapter 29:48. Ji Xinyu raised her head and laughed. You really have a good idea. Unfortunately, I can't agree to it. As she spoke, the ice sword in her hand was once again cut into several pieces by the divine sword. And her fire sword had just spat out a round of fire, burning the divine sword red. The divine sword was still waiting for her to spray water at it, but it didn't expect Ji Xinyu's left hand to form a seal in the air, and a yellow sword instantly formed in her palm. She waved her hand, and a large wave of yellow soil greeted the divine sword. The divine sword didn't seem to have expected this at all, and it subconsciously used Ji Xinyu's move to block it. It didn't expect that after using this move, not only did it not avoid the yellow soil, it was as if it was attracting the soil, and its beautiful and clean sword body was wrapped in the yellow soil. This divine sword had a problem. It was very clean, and couldn't tolerate the slightest bit of dirt on its body. So it wasn't afraid of Ji Xinyu using fire and water to refine it, because the more she refined it, the cleaner it would be. But it was a little afraid of dirt, especially when it was burning red. It couldn't get the dirt off its body. What was worse was that after it was wrapped in the yellow soil, before it could shake it off, another wave of water hit it. If there was enough water, it could actually wash away the dirt on its body, but there was very little water, so little that it just happened to turn the dirt on its body into mud. It was already late at night, and the divine sword wrapped in mud dived into the lake at the foot of the mountain without a care, disappearing in the blink of an eye. It wanted to take a bath. It wanted to wash off the dirt on its body. Ji Xinyu also slowly landed on the ground. Senior sister. A person rushed out from the crowd of spectators. It was Xie Fenglu. He directly jumped in front of Ji Xinyu. Senior sister, does this count as your win? Come, wipe your sweat first. He took out a clean silk handkerchief from somewhere and was about to wipe the sweat off Ji Xinyu's face. Ji Xinyu took a step back, and casually used a cleansing spell on herself. She returned to being clean and refreshed. She looked at Xie Fenglu. You haven't left yet. Before Princess Xinyu leaves the mountain, he won't leave. Princess Xinyu's skills are good. This is the first time I've seen a woman with such superb skills. I'm impressed. Huang Qingliu's robes fluttered as she walked over. She smiled and cupped her hands towards Ji Xinyu. Congratulations Princess Xinyu for defeating this divine sword. This battle will definitely be recorded in the annals of history. When Ji Xinyu and this sword fought, the wind and clouds in the sky roiled. Naturally, it also alarmed the heroes who were chased down the mountain and were waiting for the result. Once the divine sword recognized its master, the enchantment it set up around the hidden sword villa would also disappear. When the crowd saw the lively fight above, some of the bolder ones flew back up out of curiosity. Xie Fenglu and Huang Qingliu were two of them. So many people had witnessed Ji Xinyu make the divine sword fall from the sky, covered in mud. Although it had already fallen into the lake and did not bubble, it was obvious that this sword had lost. The swordsmiths of Hidden Sword Villa were so excited that their eyes were brimming with tears. This scourge could finally leave. Ji Shinyu had been staring at the surface of the lake the entire time. Ever since the sword had landed, the surface of the lake had been churning non-stop like a boiling pot. It was obvious that the sword was struggling in the water. Some sharp-eyed people could even see that the sword was desperately swimming around in the lake, trying to get rid of the mud on its body. After a while, the sword rushed out of the water and hovered in front of Ji Shinyu. Its muddy body trembled slightly. Chapter 29:49. The sword rushed out of the water and hovered in front of Ji Shinyu. Its muddy body trembled slightly, as if it was extremely angry. What's with this mud? Why can't I get it off? Ji Shinyu hugged her arms and did not answer its question directly. She only said 3 words, "You lost." The divine sword froze and stopped spamming. It suddenly rushed down to take a bath during the fight, which naturally meant that it lost. Although the divine sword was arrogant, it was still reasonable and did not deny it. "Yes, I lost." The sword turned, and with a buzz in the air, the scabbard appeared and flew directly to Ji Shinyu's waist. Then the sword flew out, and streaks of sword chi shot onto a large bluestone on the opposite side. A line of words appeared on the bluestone: "I admit defeat. From today onwards, you are my master." Everyone saw this line of words, and the crowd instantly burst into cheers. Ji Shinyu's lips twitched and she communicated with the sword. "I said, I won't accept you. I don't want to be your master." This sword was so arrogant, it even dared to tear its master apart. If she really accepted it, who knew how much trouble it would cause in the future? Ji Shinyu did not want to always clean up after a sword. She did not want to sleep with a tiger beside her, but we have already established a blood contract. You are already my master. The divine sword finally said the main point. Ji Shinyu, she gritted her teeth, "Nonsense. When did I establish a blood contract with you? It was when you pulled me out. In order to force my sword chi, you bled a few drops of blood from your palm. That was your heart's blood. After it entered my body, it established a blood contract." The divine sword gave her the knowledge. Ji Shinyu secretly clenched her fists. "If that's the case, then why did you still fight with me? Since it had already recognized her as its master, then why did this broken sword fight with her for so long?" "I said, I want to see your actual ability." The divine sword did not regret it at all. Ji Shinyu glanced at it. "When you fought with me, it didn't look like you were just testing my skills." If she had reacted a little slower, she would have probably died under its sword. "Since I want to force out your real skills, I naturally have to play for real." "Then aren't you afraid of playing with your master to death?" "If that's the case, then I can only find the next master." Ji Shinyu, so after killing its master, it could still find another master. No wonder it dared to be so unbridled. Ji Shinyu laughed. "So I'm your master now." "That's right. You are now my master. I will become the best weapon in your hands and send you to the peak of martial arts." The divine sword was full of ambition. Jesus. It's Ji Shinyu turned around. "Although the martial arts you just learned are very powerful, once they are used for a long time, the structure of your sword body will change a little. Especially after being heated up, the sword body will be more likely to be stained with soil. At this time, if you stab into the ground again, the earth element will directly mix with the iron element in your body." Ji Shinyu slowly explained the principle to it, and finally added, "Because it's an elemental change, once this soil enters your body, it can't be washed away with water." Chapter 29:50. She looked at its muddy body again. "Actually, you're just a little ugly right now. Your sharpness and functions won't be affected. Divine Sword was speechless. It was as if thunder had struck its head. It gritted its teeth. So you're saying that when you found out that I could learn your moves, you started to set me up? Ji Xinyu smiled. This isn't a trap, it's a strategy. She had long seen that if she used normal methods to fight with this sword, although she could win in the end, it would take a lot of energy and telekinesis. Maybe after this fight, she would use up 2/3 of her telekinesis and wouldn't be able to recover it for a year and a half. Ji Xinyu had fought countless battles in her life and was already an experienced fighter. On the battlefield, she was good at catching the opponent's weakness and then giving them a fatal blow. So when she found out that this proud divine sword was afraid of getting dirty and liked to learn other people's martial arts, she thought of this trick and made it unknowingly fall into her trap. Since the divine sword had chosen its master, everyone naturally bid farewell. This time, after everyone was eliminated by the divine sword and thrown off the mountain, the head of Hidden Sword Manor felt a little sorry for them. He sent someone to tell them that once the divine sword chose its master, Hidden Sword Manor would compensate everyone who came up the mountain. The head even promised to personally invite them again. However, after Ji Xinyu and the divine sword's fight, the manor sent another message saying that the head of the manor had urgent matters to attend to and wouldn't be coming to see everyone off. However, the promised compensation was still available. Hidden Sword Manor's compensation was a sharp dagger for everyone. This dagger naturally wasn't a divine weapon, but it was still abnormally sharp and much stronger than the normal weapons on this continent. Everyone was naturally happy, and after thanking the head of the manor, they left. Ji Xinyu naturally left with Xie Fengliu. According to Xie Fengliu's idea, the two of them should explore the martial arts world together because he heard that there was a kind of clam in the crystal sky sea. This clam's pearl could illuminate 100 miles at night and was an extremely rare treasure. He wanted to go there with Ji Xinyu to find that kind of clam. If they could find that pearl, then their master's birthday gift next year would be settled. Ji Xinyu looked up at the sky and made some calculations with her fingers in her sleeves. Then, she agreed. What she needed to do could only be done on the 1st of every month, and it was only the 5th now. She still had more than 20 days, so she could make it in time. In that case, she might as well go and pick some clam pearls first. The earlier she could complete her master's birthday present, the earlier she could put down one of her worries. The crystallized sea was somewhat like the North Pole, an extremely cold place. There were countless large and small icebergs on the surface of the sea. The seawater was as blue as deep crystal. It was said that the bottom of the sea was completely paved with crystals and corals, like a crystal palace. Therefore, this sea area was called the Celestial Crystal Sea. The Celestial Crystal Sea was the most beautiful sea in the Fanine continent. It was also the most unpredictable sea. The weather on the sea was extremely unpredictable. One moment it was calm, and the surface of the sea could be used as a mirror for grooming oneself. The next moment, it would be a hurricane, and the roaring of the sea could set off waves that were hundreds of feet high. That power could destroy everything in the world, even the icebergs floating on the surface of the sea were no exception. Oftentimes, after a hurricane, the icebergs on the surface of the sea would have a new appearance. The old icebergs might have been smashed, and the new icebergs would successfully reform. Because it was too dangerous, this place was deserted. Chapter 2951. Because it was too dangerous, this place was deserted. Even if everyone knew that this place produced these special clam pearls, not many people dared to try their luck. Even for Ji Xinyu, it was her first time here. Fortunately, Xie Fengliu knew the way and rode a cloud to this place with Ji Xinyu. Ji Xinyu was wrapped in a fur coat and sat on an ice rock, looking into the distance. The sun in the sky was as pale as a piece of paper, hanging there diagonally, without a trace of heat. Cold, this place was really cold. The bright moon clam you mentioned is in this area. Ji Shinyu looked around. Other than the pure white snow and the icy blue seawater, there were no other colors and no other creatures. It should be this area. Xia Fenglu nodded. However, I heard that the bright moon clam will only open its shell to dry its pearls in the middle of the night. We can only take them at that time. Ji Shinyu wrapped herself in the furry fur coat and calculated the time with her fingers. The corner of her mouth twitched. There are still 8 hours before the middle of the night. 8 hours was 8 hours. In this place where the cold wind howled, if they just sat there, wouldn't they be frozen into an ice sculpture? Xia Fenglu didn't mind. Senior sister, this place is so beautiful, it's not bad for us to enjoy the sea view first. Ji Shinyu wrapped her clothes again. I don't think it's beautiful, but it's cold. Master, do you want to make a fire? The divine sword that had been hanging beside Ji Shinyu came over. Make a fire. Yes, she could make a big fire here. But, in this place of ice and snow, where could she find wood to make a fire? The divine sword understood her thoughts and immediately said, don't you know how to condense all kinds of elements? There must be wood elements in the air here. Ji Shinyu glanced at it. Wood elements are very scarce here, it's not easy to condense them. If she concentrated her power, it wasn't that she couldn't condense them, but it would take too much mental power. It wasn't worth it just to make a fire for warmth. Xia Fenglu had been looking at her the entire time. Although he could not see the divine sword in Ji Shinyu's mind, he could still hear Ji Shinyu's words, and knew that she could communicate with the divine sword. He nodded. The wood element here is much less than in other places. It's not easy to condense it. He slapped his head. I should have thought of this earlier. If I had known, I would have brought some wood. There's a type of fish here that tastes pretty good, especially when roasted. It's even more delicious. Unfortunately. It's a small world. I didn't expect to meet the two of you here. A clear voice rang out from the icy peak not far away and entered their ears. Xia Fenglu froze. Ji Shinyu raised her head and looked in the direction of the voice. They saw Huang Qinglu standing on top of the icy peak with her sleeves fluttering in the wind, looking at them with a smile. Xia Fenglu clenched his fists and looked at him coldly. Why are you so persistent? He's following us again. Huang Qinglu said innocently, Brother Xia, you're wrong. I arrived an hour earlier than you. With a twist of his finger, a piece of wood appeared in his palm. I've prepared some wood. Why don't we do it together? Huang Qinglu seemed to have come prepared. Not only did he bring enough wood, he also brought a warm bear skin and even a fishing rod. Xia Fenglu looked at the things he took out and sneered, You brought enough things. Chapter 2952. Huang Qinglu had a good temper, and, thank you for the compliment, I've always thought things through. He laid the bear skin on a large ice rock and cupped his hands towards Ji Shinyu with a smile. It's okay for us two rough men to be cold, but Princess Shinyu is a girl after all, we still need to keep her warm. Let's sit on this. This person was gentle and meticulous, the complete opposite of Xia Fenglu's carefree personality. If they were together, they might really complement each other. Ji Shinyu didn't know what was going on, but she actually thought of this first. This Huang Qinglu came for Xia Fenglu. Ji Shinyu knew this very well. If it wasn't for the fact that she was afraid that her master would explode and slap Xia Fenglu's baby face into a cucumber in anger, Ji Shinyu would be very willing to help them. Or maybe she would plead for her junior brother when the time came. Actually, as long as it was true love, even if he was gay, she should still help him, right? With this thought in mind, Ji Shinyu politely thanked Huang Qinglu. This bear skin isn't small, the three of us can sit on it. Men and women shouldn't touch each other, senior sister, let's not sit with him. Xia Fenglu was very straightforward. He cut off a wash basin-sized piece of the bear's skin and threw it to Huang Qinglu. You sit on this. Huang Qinglu smiled. He wasn't picky. He took it and sat down. You guys start the fire, I'll fish. With a flick of the fishing rod, the long fishing line was thrown out into the sea. This young master Huang Qinglu really had a good temper. No matter how Xia Fenglu gave him attitude, he didn't get angry at all, he just did his own thing. Seeing this, Ji Xinyu admired him a little. Compared to him, his little junior brother was like an unreasonable young girl. She thought for a moment, then cut the bear's skin in two and threw one piece to Xia Fenglu. You're right, men and women shouldn't touch each other, don't sit with me. Xia Fenglu. He sat down on the bear's skin weakly. He didn't give up and added, we're senior and junior brothers, naturally we should be closer than normal people, the rule of men and women not touching each other doesn't suit us. Ji Xinyu ignored him, her gaze landing on the pile of wood. The lumber that Huang Qinglu brought along was huge and couldn't be lit all at once. It was best to chop it into firewood. She arranged a piece of wood and was about to take out her knife when she suddenly thought of something. She ordered the divine sword that was hanging in the air beside her, come, chop them into firewood. Chop them evenly. The divine sword immediately became angry. I am a divine sword, not a chopping axe. There are no axes here, only your blade and mine. Ji Xinyu tried to reason with it. Then let your saber go. I think it would be happy to do this kind of rough work. With me by your side, it will probably be able to do this in the future. The Azura blade buzzed in Ji Xinyu's storage space. It was used to chopping firewood, and out of habit, it wanted to jump out and help its master. But Ji Xinyu pressed it down. No, you've just been injured, and I haven't tempered you yet. You're not suitable for this kind of work for now. She looked at the divine sword again. If you still treat me as your master, then do this work, don't bargain. You seem to value this broken saber a lot. 10,000 of them can't compare to a small piece of my sword, but you treat it so well. Chapter 2953. The divine sword's heart was filled with indignation, and its words sounded like it was gnashing its teeth. Because it has followed me through life and death countless times. Countless times, it has blocked disaster for me at the most dangerous times. No matter what I do, it will not betray its master. If I die, it will definitely follow me. Can you do this? The divine sword was stuck there, and only after a while did it reply, it is only blindly loyal. A divine weapon will not be like this. Ji Xinyu smiled faintly. Loyalty is the most important characteristic of a weapon. It does not matter if it is a divine weapon or a mortal weapon. She looked at the pile of firewood again. If you can even refuse to do this, then if I really encounter danger in the future, how can I dare to use you? Divine sword. Ji Xinyu picked up a piece of firewood and casually chopped it. You don't have to do it. Her movements were clean and nimble. Once she circulated her energy in her palm, it was not inferior to a sword. The divine sword was stunned for a moment, then suddenly jumped up. The sword's body was like lightning, dancing around the pile of firewood in the air. A moment later, the pile of firewood was chopped into pieces of firewood as thick as a child's wrist, neatly chopped, and the size was the same, as if it was directly cut by a machine. The firewood even automatically formed a pile of firewood, forming a conical shape with a narrow top and a wide bottom, looking very orderly. This should be fine, right? The divine sword said this in Ji Xinyu's mind, then flew away, disappearing in the air in a flash. Ji Xinyu. This guy wouldn't just run away in anger, right? With this guy's temper and personality, it was very possible. She shook her head, raised her hand and shot out a flame, finally lighting a fire. The bonfire burned brightly, illuminating the faces of the three people. Xia Fenglu shaded his eyes with his hand, looked in the direction the divine sword flew, and said uncertainly, "It ran away just like that?" Ji Shenyu replied, then sighed, "It has a bad temper." She had never seen a weapon with such a bad temper. This divine sword really opened her eyes. Xia Fenglu also sighed, "You letting it chop firewood is a bit insulting, it is a divine sword." Ji Shenyu finally took out her azure saber. While gently wiping it with a cloth, she casually replied, "To be my weapon, you have to be able to kill wolves and cut firewood. I often do the same thing with this knife. I even use this knife as a stick to grill chicken wings." Xia Fenglu. He looked at the saber and couldn't help but nod. "That's true, your weapon must be very sturdy." He had personally seen Ji Shenyu use this saber to dig the ground, and that divine sword was indeed too delicate, and it was especially unruly. Once it leaves, will it not come back? Xia Feng looked in that direction for a long time, but did not see the shadow of the sword. Ji Shenyu also took a look and wasn't too sure. Perhaps. Just as the two of them were discussing this, a strange sound suddenly came from the sea in the distance. There was no wind, but waves nearly 1 meter high rose out of nowhere. There was also the sound of something hitting the water surface. What's going on? There were monsters in the sea. Are they coming out? The three of them immediately gripped their weapons tightly, staring at the waves that were getting closer and closer. "Hey, there are so many fish!" Xia Fenglu suddenly shouted. Ji Shenyu also saw that there were countless fish jumping on the surface of the sea, rolling towards them. Chapter 2954. It was as if there was something below that was driving the fishes away, causing them to panic. Ji Shenyu's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? This was that sword. Before she could finish her thought, a white light suddenly shot up from the sea, and in the blink of an eye, it reached the small ice mountain that Ji Shenyu and the others were on, and arrived in front of them. It was that divine sword. Its body had actually turned into a long strip, and on the long strip was a string of fish. Big ones, small ones, black ones, white ones, flowery ones, there were actually all kinds of fish. These fish were strung on the sword's body, and they were struggling with all their might, looking a little funny and bloody. The sword even wrote a line of words in Ji Shenyu's mind. "What kind of fish do you want to eat? Pick one, I'll go down and catch it." So this sword didn't run away in a fit of anger, but went down to catch fish. Ji Shenyu was a little moved, and let Huang Qinglu, who knew the ropes, choose the most delicious variety. Huang Qinglu clicked her tongue in wonder as she put away the fishing rod. She took care of the chosen fish in advance. The divine sword, on the other hand, tossed all of the fish down. Other than the one that Huang Qinglu had chosen, the rest were all directly absorbed by it. Ji Shenyu could only watch as it sucked the dozen or so fish dry. Not only Ji Shenyu, even Xia Fenglu was a little stunned. Was this a divine sword or a demon sword? The sword turned around and dived into the water again. It was probably going to catch the fish it had chosen. Ji Shenyu thought for a moment, then hurriedly took a step forward and shouted into the sea, "Don't catch too many, just 3 more will do." The divine sword was indeed going to catch fish, and it caught fish much faster than Huang Qinglu. Before Huang Qinglu could deal with the 2 fish in her hands, the sword came up again. This time, there were 4 fat, white, and tender fish strung on the sword. What was even more rare was that these fish were all the same size, like quadruplets. This time, even Huang Qinglu clicked her tongue in wonder, and laughed, as expected of a divine sword. The size of these fish is just right. The meat is too tender if it's small, the meat is too tough if it's big, the meat is the most delicious if it's big. With the divine sword here, we don't have to worry about not being able to catch fish to eat. The divine sword gleamed proudly, then circled around Ji Shinyu, as if waiting for her praise. Ji Shinyu smiled and didn't say anything. She formed a seal with her fingers and then flicked it at the divine sword. A faint green light surrounded the divine sword. The divine sword trembled and instinctively dodged with a hum. Then, it hovered above Ji Shinyu. "Master, what are you doing?" Ji Shinyu crossed her arms and looked at it. "What do you think I'm doing?" She then looked at it from head to toe and said indifferently, "You can go look at your body." The divine sword should be suspicious. It flew in front of an ice rock that was as smooth as a mirror. The ice rock clearly reflected the body of its sword. The originally modeled sword had actually lost many of its spots, revealing its snow-white bottom. It turned out that its master was removing those dirty spots from its body. The divine sword was excited. He immediately flew in front of Ji Shinyu, "So these spots can be removed. Master, cast another spell on me and remove all of them." "Remove all of them?" Ji Shinyu crossed her arms and smiled. "My spell just now could have removed all the spots on your body, but you didn't believe me and directly dodged. It seems that you still don't treat me as your master." Chapter 2955. The divine sword paused and admitted its mistake. "I'm sorry." It circled around Ji Shinyu again, paused for a moment, and rubbed the hilt of its sword against her shoulder. "Master, please use that spell again." "I won't dodge it this time." Ji Shinyu yawned. "That won't do. That spell has a limit. It can only be used once a month." The divine sword, it seemed to have been hit by a blow, lying down and going back into the scabbard. Ji Shinyu ignored it and looked at Huang Qinglu roasting fish. Xia Fenglu couldn't help but laugh. "Senior sister, this sword is very interesting. Have you given it a name?" Ji Shinyu paused and raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Isn't it called the divine sword?" Xia Fenglu laughed. "That's just the name everyone gave it. After all, this kind of divine weapon is rare in the world. You need to give it another name." Ji Shinyu rubbed her eyebrows. "I see, yes, senior sister, you should give it another name. Give it a nice name, after all, it's so extraordinary." "That's true," Ji Shinyu muttered. Song. The divine sword came out of its scabbard again, standing upright in front of Ji Shinyu, as if it was looking at her expectantly. Ji Shinyu looked at it for a moment, then said a name, "Flower Sword." The divine sword trembled. It didn't seem to believe that she would give it such a vulgar name, so it moved closer to her so that she could see it more clearly. At the same time, it said in her mind, "It's too vulgar, you need to give it a domineering name." Ji Shinyu felt that she didn't have enough literary cells, but the divine sword's words gave her some inspiration. "Then what about Overlord Sword?" "The divine sword," it said in Ji Shinyu's mind again, but because it was too excited, the words it said were trembling. "Don't give it a random name. You only have 3 chances to give it a name, so don't give it a random name." "I don't want to be so straightforward, it's not beautiful." Ji Shinyu was worried. She was too lazy to waste her brain cells on these things, but this divine sword had so many problems. She suggested to the divine sword, "Since you're so cultured, why don't you give it a name?" The divine sword was indignant. "It has to be decided by master." As he only had one chance, the divine sword hurriedly instructed, "Discuss with me before you speak. It must be domineering and meaningful." Ji Shinyu felt a headache coming on. She wasn't good at being domineering and insightful. She simply handed the problem over to Xia Fenglu and Huang Qinglu. "Can you two help me think of a domineering and meaningful name?" The divine sword knew that it could not rely too much on its master, so it immediately turned around and flew in front of the 2 people. It circled around them and tried its best to shine brightly, trying its best to show that it was extraordinary. Divine Wind Sword. Divine Martial Sword. Windflower Sword. Chinkuan Sword. The two of them were quite enthusiastic. Sure enough, they came up with some names for it. These names weren't too vulgar, but the divine sword felt that they didn't fit its style. They were all rejected. In the end, it was Xia Fenglu who came up with an idea. He smiled and said, "Senior sister, since it's your treasured sword, why don't we name it after you? How about we call it the Moon God Sword?" The divine sword paused for a moment, then immediately became excited, and continuously spammed in Ji Xinyu's mind, "Good. Good. That's a good name, let's call it that. I'm called the Moon God Sword." Ji Xinyu frowned slightly. "This name is just reversing my name." Chapter 2956. Master, your name is pretty good. If it's reversed, then so be it. I think it's pretty good. Since it had agreed, Ji Xinyu was too lazy to waste her brain cells. She nodded, "All right, then let's call it Moon God Sword." Just as she said this, a ball of light flashed across the divine sword. When the light dissipated, 3 ancient characters appeared on the sword, Moon God Sword. The Moon God Sword shone on the mirror-like ice stone. When it saw the name on its sword, it immediately became happy. It also found Xia Fenglu pleasing to the eye. It circled around him a few times and even flashed at him. Xia Fenglu laughed, "Are you expressing your good feelings towards me? Ha, you are my senior sister's sword. Senior sister and I are inseparable. Who knows, I might even become half your master in the future. Being able to give you a name might prove a kind of fate." His words had a hidden meaning. Ji Xinyu frowned slightly. "Old 9, you're talking nonsense again. Senior sister, I'm serious. The Moon God Sword is your sword, and I gave it a name that it happened to like. This proves that we are fated. Don't you think so? Moon God Sword." The last sentence was directed at the Moon God Sword. The Moon God Sword had a good impression of him, so it immediately lit up again. Then, it circled around the two of them. Because it was spinning very fast, it left behind an afterimage in the air. It was as if there was a shining silver circle behind the two of them. That circle was even in the shape of a heart, adding a bit of romance. Xia Fenglu laughed, "Senior sister, look, the Moon God Sword also thinks highly of us. The circle it drew is like the Moon God's red line." Ji Xinyu grabbed the sword and looked at it with a smile that was not a smile. "You're messing around again. Don't you want to get rid of the spots on your body?" The Moon God Sword shook and automatically went back into its sheath. It stopped messing around. Xia Fenglu sighed, "Senior sister, this is your fault. Since the Moon God Sword is a divine weapon, it must have foresight. It's just telling the truth. Why are you threatening it like that?" Just as Ji Xinyu was about to say something, she suddenly smelled something and turned to look at Huang Qinglu. "Hey, your fish is burnt." Huang Qinglu seemed to be distracted. He looked down at the fish in his hand and smiled. "I'm sorry." With a flick of his wrist, the fish flew out in a parabolic arc and fell back into the sea. Xia Fenglio's heart ached. "What's wrong with you? You can even burn a grilled fish." Huang Qinglu raised his head. Under the light blue sky, his eyes were a little deep, and there seemed to be floating ice flashing at the bottom of his eyes. Xia Fenglu felt a chill in his heart. He raised his chin slightly and said, "Why are you looking at me? Am I wrong?" Huang Qinglu suddenly smiled. That smile was faintly evil. "Look at you. Look at you. It's nothing. I'll just roast it again. I guarantee that you'll be satisfied." He went back to the fish. Ji Xinyu watched from the side. She felt that her junior brother was like a little girl throwing a tantrum in front of Huang Qinglu. The interaction between the two of them was indeed a little strange. The more she looked, the more they looked like a couple. Ji Xinyu seemed to see her master carrying a big stick and rushing over with a murderous aura. She could not help but rub her eyebrows. It seemed that this junior brother was destined to make her worry. Old 9, when did you meet this young Master Huang? Ji Xinyu felt that it was necessary to ask. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.